The secret room behind the master bedroom. The first time I saw it, I honestly thought it was a prank. Some clever escape room gimmick the owner forgot to mention in the listing. Because that's what your brain does when it needs an answer fast. It grabs the safest explanation and clings to it like a life raft. But there was nothing playful about the way the wall sounded when my knuckles hit it. Not hollow dry like cheap paneling. Not solid like a stud. Something in between like a surface, trying to pretend it belonged there. We had been in the cabin less than an hour. The heat was running, the place smelled like pine cleaner and fireplace ash, and outside the windows the woods stood perfectly still under fresh snow, the branches bowed like tired arms. It was supposed to be one of those winter getaways people brag about online. 2 nights, no emails, no city noise, just a crackling fire, and that cozy feeling like the world can't reach you. The listing called it remote but safe, which is a sentence you don't think twice about until you're actually there. Miles from the nearest town, watching your phone cycle between one bar and none, like it can't decide whether to give you hope. My girlfriend Mara was in the kitchen unpacking groceries, humming softly, like she always does when she's trying to make a place feel like ours. I was carrying suitcases into the master bedroom, the one with the thick quilt and the antler lamp, and the window that looked out on nothing but trees. The bed frame was heavy wood, the kind that creaks if you breathe too hard. And in the corner was an armoire, big old painted, a soft white, that didn't match the rest of the cabin. It looked like it had been moved from another house, and never really belonged here. I opened it to hang our coats, and the door swung to easily, like it had been used recently. Inside it was deeper than it should have been, not just deeper wrong. The back panel sat a few inches farther than the frame suggested. I leaned in, ran my fingers along the interior, and felt a seam I couldn't unfeel. The panel had a hairline crack painted over the sort of thing you'd ignore if you weren't already a little uneasy from the silence outside. I pressed on it, expecting solid resistance. Instead, it shifted just a fraction, and a cold draft slipped out like a sigh. My stomach tightened in that instant, the way it does, right before a bad memory you didn't ask for rises up anyway. I told myself, old cabin, settling wood, weird construction. I pushed again harder. The panel flexed, then clicked, and the entire back of the armoire swung inward on hidden hinges. Not a crack, not a gap. A door. A doorway. The space behind it was black, and the air that rolled out wasn't just cold. It was stale, like a room that hasn't been aired out in a long time, layered with the sour edge of unwashed fabric. I stood there with my hand still on the panel, listening. The cabin was quiet, except for the furnace and the faint clink of Mara setting something on the counter. In the darkness beyond the armoire, there was no sound at all, which somehow felt worse than if I'd heard a mouse. My first thought was that we'd found a maintenance crawlspace. My second thought was that no maintenance crawlspace needs a hidden hinge behind a master bedroom wardrobe. I called out, trying to sound casual, "Hey Mara, come look at this." She answered from the kitchen. "Is it a bear rug or something?" I didn't laugh. She came in, wiping her hands on a dish towel, smiling, until she saw my face and the open armoire and the dark space behind it. The smile drained away in a slow, confused fade. "What is that?" she whispered, like the cabin might be listening. I turned on my phone flashlight and aimed it into the opening. The beam cut through dust motes and landed on a narrow room just big enough for a person to lie down. The floor was unfinished plywood. The walls were raw timber, and there against the far wall was a sleeping bag, not rolled and stored like an extra, laid out flat like someone had just gotten up. Next to it were a couple of granola bar wrappers, a half-empty bottle of water, and a small pile of things that made my throat go tight. A phone charger, a cheap LED lantern, and a pair of men's boots. Vedboots. The tread, still dark, with slush. Mara made a sound that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a sob. Just breath caught in the wrong place. That's not ours," she said, stating the obvious, like saying it out loud might turn it into a mistake. I stepped closer, careful, because the space felt like stepping into somebody else's breath. The sleeping bag was the kind you buy at a big box store, blue nylon with a broken zipper. There were indentations in it, creases that suggested a body had been there recently. I lifted the edge with 2 fingers, and the smell hit harder. Old sweat, sour fabric, and something like cigarettes, masked with peppermint gum. My light swept over the corner and stopped on a plastic grocery bag filled with canned food. Labels facing out, soup beans, chili, all recent, not dusty, not years old. I turned and looked at Mara. Her eyes were wide and glossy, and she had the dish towel balled in her fist so tight her knuckles were pale. "This is a prank, right?" she asked, but her voice didn't believe it. I stepped into the room and the floor gave a small creak that sounded too loud. My flashlight found something else. A vent cut into the wood positioned at head height pointed directly toward the master bedroom. A vent that wasn't connected to any ductwork. Just a rectangular hole covered with a mesh screen. I leaned in and saw through that mesh a faint line of light, our bedroom visible from the other side like a tiny theater. You could lie here, perfectly hidden, and watch someone sleep. The worst part was realizing how intentional it all was. The hinges were concealed. The armoire disguised the entrance. The vent was placed like an eye. This wasn't a leftover feature. This was built for a purpose. Mara's voice was shaking now. "We should leave." No. I wanted to say yes, instantly, to grab her coat, to drive back down the mountain and never speak of it again. But outside the sky had that heavy, low look of incoming snow, and when I glanced through the bedroom window I saw the driveway already softening at the edges, the tire tracks filling in like the woods were erasing our arrival. "We can't just—" I started, and then my phone buzzed once in my hand. One bore, then none. I tried calling the host through the rental app. It rang, and then went to voicemail. The voicemail greeting was cheerful and generic, like a business line. I left a message I tried to keep calm. "Hi, we just arrived and we found a hidden room behind the armoire in the master bedroom. There are personal items in it. Please call me back immediately." Mara stared at me like I was insane for leaving any message at all, like we'd just informed the wolf we were home. We pulled our bags back into the living room, shut every curtain and tried to pretend we were being rational adults. We told ourselves it could be an emergency hidey hole for storms. It could be a previous guest's stash that housekeeping missed. But the wet boots ruined every comforting theory. Someone had been in there after the last snowfall. After the driveway was plowed. After the cleaning crew supposedly turned the cabin over. Someone had been there close enough to hear the furnace kick on and the groceries hit the counter. We searched the rest of the cabin with all the bravado two people can fake when they're terrified. Closet after closet. Under beds. Behind shower curtains. We checked the basement door. It was locked with a heavy padlock from the outside, which made no sense because the basement access was inside the cabin. The only key on the ring was for the front door and a little tag that said shed, but the shed outside was buried almost to the handle in snow. As the afternoon dimmed, the wind picked up and the trees began to creak. The cozy cabin vibe the listing promised turned into a box of thin walls surrounded by endless dark. We shoved a chair under the front doorknob and piled our suitcases against the master bedroom door like it would stop anything more determined than a draft. Mara kept glancing toward the hallway, toward that armoire, like it might open on its own. At dinner, neither of us could eat. The fire popped. The wind moaned against the roof. And every time the cabin settled, every small shift of wood, we flinched like it was a footstep. Around 10, the power blinked once. Just long enough for the living room to go black and the fear to surge like a wave. The lights came back, but the message landed anyway. "You are not in control out here." We tried to sleep on the couch, staying in the same room, like if something happened we'd face it together. Mara held my arm so tightly, it hurt. I lay, staring at the window, at the reflection of the room, at the black behind it. At some point I heard something that made my skin go cold, a faint scrape, not from outside, but from inside the walls. Like fabric shifting, like a zipper pulling halfway and stopping. I held my breath. Mara whispered, barely audible. "Did you hear that I didn't answer? Because if I answered it would make it real." Then, from the direction of the master bedroom, came a soft click. The kind of click a latch makes when it releases. We sat up at the same time, our eyes locked on the hallway. The cabin was quiet, except for the wind and the fire and the frantic animal sound of our breathing. "No," Mara mouthed. I stood slowly and grabbed the fireplace poker, because it was the only thing in reach that made me feel less helpless. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I crept down the hallway, every floorboard a betrayal. The master bedroom door was shut, but the crack at the bottom showed a sliver of darkness. I pushed it open with the poker. The room was cold, even though the heat was on. My flashlight beam landed on the armoire. Its doors were closed. The back panel, our hidden door, was closed too, but the armoire itself was shifted slightly, just a few inches, as if someone had leaned on it from inside. I froze. I listened so hard, my ears hurt. Nothing. I stepped closer, the poker out in front of me, and my light swept the floor. There, in the thin dust near the armoire, was a fresh smear, like the mark of a boot heel. Wet dark, leading from the armoire toward the bedroom window and back again. Mara appeared behind me, trembling her phone in her hand like it could save her. "Please," she whispered, "please don't open it." I wanted to do what she asked. I also wanted to know, because not knowing felt like giving the darkness permission. I gripped the edge of the armoire and pulled. The door opened with the same smooth practice swing as before. The little room beyond was empty. The sleeping bag was gone. The boots were gone. The wrappers and the water bottle and the charger gone. But the air was warmer, like someone had been lying there moments ago. And on the floor, right where the sleeping bag had been, was a small object that made my throat close a single key, plain and silver, with a white tag tied to it. On the tag, written in neat block letters, were 2 words, Master Lock. Mara started to cry, silently at first, then harder, covering her mouth so the sound wouldn't carry. I picked up the key with shaking fingers and turned it over. It wasn't ours. It didn't match the cabin key. It was the kind of key you use on a padlock, on a basement door. Behind us, somewhere in the cabin, something shifted soft, like weight moving off a couch cushion. We didn't wait to confirm it. We grabbed our coats, our phones, whatever we could reach, and ran into the snow like the cold was better than the walls. The wind hit like a slap. The driveway was already half covered. The car glazed in ice. I fumbled with the door handle, fingers numb, brain screaming. Mara kept looking back at the cabin, at the lit windows, at the warm yellow glow that now felt like bait. We got the car started on the 3rd try. As we backed out, the headlights swept across the front porch, and for a single second I thought I saw movement behind the living room curtain, a shape that shouldn't have been there because we weren't there anymore, a face-height shadow watching us leave. When we hit the main road, the snow came down heavier, swallowing the cabin behind us as if it had never existed. We drove until we found signal, until my phone finally showed bars like a lifeline. I called the host again. This time he answered on the 2nd ring, cheerful as ever. "Hey, everything okay?" I tried to speak, but the words tangled in fear. Mara leaned over and shouted. There was a hidden room behind the armoire. Someone was in it. Someone was inside the cabin with us. There was a pause on the line, just long enough for me to imagine him smiling. Then he said calmly, "Hidden room, that's impossible." And before I could respond, he added, "By the way, you didn't happen to unlock the basement door, did you?" I think the owner is still here. I knew something was wrong before we even brought the bags inside, because the porch light was already on when we pulled up, and it wasn't one of those motion sensor lights that clicks on when you step onto the boards. It was steady, warm, welcoming, like someone had been waiting. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow plowed lane surrounded by trees packed tight like a wall. Snow piled against the steps. Wind pushed powder across the driveway in thin sheets, erasing our tire tracks almost as soon as we made them. The listing photos had looked perfect. A little A-frame, big windows, a wood stove, secluded luxury. The host messaged us the door code. The morning of said we could check in early, said he wouldn't bother us, that he lived a couple towns over, and valued privacy as much as his guests did. That's exactly what you want to hear when you're renting a place in the middle of nowhere. Privacy. Independence. No awkward key exchange. No small talk. Just you and the quiet. Mara typed in the code, the lock beeped, and the door opened without resistance. The air inside was warm. Not the furnace has been running all day warm. Lived in. Warm. Like the kind of heat that lingers after someone's been moving around. The living room smelled faintly of coffee, and wood smoke. The wood stove had ash in it that looked fresh, not the pale, powdery ash you see after a long time. These were darker chunks, like the embers had died recently. Maybe the cleaning crew just left, I said, because again, your brain reaches for safe answers. Mara nodded, but she didn't look convinced. We stepped in, and the floorboards didn't just creak, they popped in a pattern, as if the wood had learned a certain rhythm. The cabin was neat, staged almost too perfectly. Blankets folded with crisp corners, throw pillows arranged like a catalogue, a guest book open on the coffee table with a pen beside it as if we were expected to sign the moment we arrived. I took off my gloves, rubbed my hands together, and that's when I noticed the coat hooks by the door. There were 4. 3 were empty. The 4th held a jacket, a men's jacket, dark green heavy canvas, dusted with snow that hadn't melted yet. My first thought was that it belonged to a previous guest who forgot it. My second thought was that if it had been forgotten, it would have been moved during cleaning, not left hanging like it was part of the decor. Mara touched the sleeve with 2 fingers. It was cold. "It's been outside," she said, quietly. "Like just now." We stood there, both of us listening. Nothing but the wind and the gentle tick of the thermostat. I wanted to laugh at ourselves. I wanted to say, "We're city people, being dramatic." But then I saw the boots. A pair of boots by the door larger than mine, wet at the soles, leaving a thin crescent of melted snow on the mat. Not our boots. We hadn't even taken ours off yet. I looked at Mara. She looked at me. No one said the obvious out loud, because once you say it, you can't take it back. Someone is here. I called out, "Hello." My voice sounded too loud, too polite, like I was knocking on a neighbor's door, not standing in a remote cabin with strange boots by the entrance. Silence answered. I took a step farther inside, scanning corners, doorways, the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The kitchen sink had a single mug in it, white ceramic, with a brown ring of coffee at the bottom. The coffee was cold, but the ring was fresh, not dried into that crust you get after hours. Beside the sink was a dish towel, damp folded over the faucet, as if someone had just used it. Mara whispered, "Call the host." I tried. The app message went through, but when I hit call, it rang twice and dropped. No service. I walked toward the Windows phone in the air like a divining rod and saw a faint set of footprints in the snow along the side of the cabin. They didn't lead up from the driveway. They came from the trees, straight to the wall, then stopped. Not continued around, not turned back, just ended at the cabin like whoever made them had stepped into it. Mara saw them too, because she made that same caught breath sound she'd made the last time we rented a place remote, but safe. "We should leave," she said. The word leave hung there heavy, because leaving meant driving back down a narrow lane, in worsening weather, possibly getting stuck, possibly trading one kind of danger for another. Staying meant staying, in a cabin that felt occupied by someone who didn't want to be seen. I made a decision that I still replay in my head because it's the moment where logic and fear argued, and fear won by pretending to be logic. I said, "Let's check every room. If it's empty, we lock up and leave. If it's not empty..." I didn't finish. We moved together slow, like we were walking through a museum exhibit we didn't trust. The bathroom door was closed. I pushed it open with my fingertips. The shower curtain was pulled all the way shut. I stared at it for a full second, waiting for it to move. It didn't. I yanked it open. Empty tub. But the mirror above the sink was fogged at the edges, like it had been wiped down recently, while still warm. On the counter was a cheap razor, still damp. Mara's face went pale. "No," she mouthed. "We checked the first bedroom. Made bed. No luggage. No person. Second bedroom. Same. Then the master bedroom. The bedspread was smooth, too smooth, like no one had slept in it, but the pillow on the left side had a slight dent, the faintest impression of a head. The closet door was cracked open a couple inches. I told myself it was nothing. I also couldn't stop staring at that crack like it was a slit in a mask. I opened it fully. Hanging inside were 3 empty hangers and 1 flannel shirt. Men's flannel. Red and black. The kind you wear to blend in with the woods. I checked the tag. No brand I recognized, just a name written in black marker on the inside collar D. Mara backed out of the room, shaking her head, whispering, "We're leaving. We're leaving right now." Then the cabin made a sound I will never forget. A low, slow creak from above us, like someone shifting weight on the roof. We froze, both of us tilting our heads. Another creak. Not random settling. Not wind. A measured sound like footsteps on wood. Mara's eyes filled with tears. "Tell me that's a branch," she whispered. I stepped toward the window and looked up. The roofline was steep, covered in snow. I couldn't see anything. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse, because it felt intentional, like whoever was up there realized we were listening. We rushed back to the living room, grabbed our coats, our keys, our phones. That's when the front door, the one we'd left open a crack, swung inward gently and then closed with a soft click as if pushed by a careful hand. There was no gust of wind. The air inside barely moved. Morris stared at the door like it had just spoken. I walked to it, grabbed the handle, and pulled. It didn't open. I pulled harder. Still nothing. The deadbolt was engaged. From the inside. In the span of seconds, someone had locked us in. Mara started to hyperventilate short, shallow breaths, hands trembling so hard she couldn't grip her phone. I tried the keypad. It beeped, angrily. Incorrect code. I tried again. Incorrect code. "It changed," Mara whispered, voice cracking. "He changed it." I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Windows. We could break a window. We could climb out. We could run. But the windows were large, thick, double pane, and outside was deep snow and biting wind. I looked toward the hallway, toward the bedrooms. I didn't want to go deeper into the cabin, but something in me understood a sick truth. Whoever was here wanted us contained. Wanted us to panic. That meant there had to be a reason. I grabbed the fireplace poker again, not because I thought it would help, but because holding something solid kept me from dissolving into fear. "We need another exit," I said, more to myself than to Mara. "Basement. Back door. Anything." We found the basement door in the kitchen. It was painted the same white as the trim, designed to blend in. There was a padlock on it. A padlock on an interior door. I stared at it the way you stare at something that shouldn't exist. Mara whispered, "This is where he is." The roof creaked again, directly overhead now, like someone moving to stand above the living room. Then came a sound from inside the walls, faint, rhythmic, like tapping. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. It wasn't a pipe. It wasn't random. It was communication. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Mara clutched my arm and hissed, "Do not answer. Do not answer." The tapping stopped. Then, from somewhere in the cabin, very softly, a voice spoke. Not loud, not threatening, almost conversational, like someone speaking through a door to a friend. "You weren't supposed to come early," it said. Mara let out a strangled sob. I stood, rooted, every hair on my arms lifted. The voice continued calm as snow falling. "I'm not ready." I forced my mouth to work. "Who are you?" I asked, and the sound of my own voice felt unreal, like it belonged to a recording. There was a pause, and then the voice replied, closer now, like it had moved down the hallway without us hearing footsteps. "It's my cabin," it said, "and you're making it loud." The lights flickered. Once. Twice. The cabin plunged into darkness for a heartbeat, then came back on. In that brief blackout, something brushed past my shoulder-light contact, like a sleeve grazing me. I spun, swinging the poker through empty air. Mara screamed. When the light steadied, the men's jacket that had been on the hook by the door was gone. In its place was a folded note, pinned neatly to the wood, with the guestbook pen. The handwriting was careful, almost pretty. It said, "Go back to the living room. Sit on the couch. Don't look at the windows." Mara shook her head violently, whispering, "No, no, no." I wanted to defy it, just to prove we still had choices. Then, outside the big living room window, a face appeared against the glass for half a second. Pale, oval eyes wide, breath fogging the pane, then vanished into the dark like it had never been there. Mara collapsed against the wall, sobbing. I realized then that this wasn't about robbing us or scaring us for fun. It was about control, about being unseen while shaping everything we did. I grabbed Mara's hand and pulled her toward the kitchen. "We're getting out," I said. "Right now." I yanked open drawers until I found a heavy chef's knife. Not because I wanted to use it, but because having it made me feel less like prey. Then I remembered the footprints along the side of the cabin that ended at the wall. Not the door. The wall. I scanned the kitchen for anything out of place, any seam, any panel. My eyes landed on a bookshelf built into the corner. It was filled with paperback thrillers and cabin decor books that looked staged their spines too clean. I grabbed the shelf and pushed. It didn't budge. I pulled. It shifted just slightly, then stopped as if caught on something. I shoved harder. The shelf moved an inch and revealed a thin line of darkness behind it. Mara stared hope and horror colliding on her face. I pulled again, and the bookshelf swung out like a door, silent on hidden hinges. Behind it was a narrow passage that smelled like damp earth and old wood. The air pouring out was colder than the cabin, like it came from below. Someone had built this. Someone had been using it. From the passage, that same calm voice spoke again, now so close, it sounded like it was right beside my ear. "Don't," it said, almost kindly. "If you go in there, you'll see where I sleep." I froze. Mara squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. The cabin felt smaller than ever, like the walls were leaning in to listen. Then, from the basement door, came the sound of a padlock, turning metal grinding slowly, deliberately, as if someone on the other side was unlocking it from within. Mara whispered, barely audible, "I think the owner is still here." And the worst part was realizing she was right, and he had been here the whole time. Watching us arrive, listening to us breathe, deciding what we were allowed to do next. I didn't find the two-way mirror because I was paranoid. I found it because the bathroom felt wrong, like the room was holding its breath. We'd been at the cabin barely 2 hours, boots by the door, groceries in the fridge, fire finally catching in the stove. Outside snow kept falling, softening the woods, until everything looked too quiet to be real. The bathroom was off the hallway, small but newly renovated, the kind of place you'd trust on sight. I turned on the vanity light, and the mirror threw my reflection back at me. Normal, bright, harmless. I washed my hands, stared at myself, and listened. Wind against the roof. Pipes ticking. No voices. I was about to leave when I noticed a faint line of condensation at the bottom edge of the mirror, like a breath mark that didn't match mine. The shower hadn't been used. Mara hadn't even unpacked. I leaned closer, and the mirror stopped feeling like glass. It felt like a window at night, where your reflection is the brightest thing, and the darkness behind it could hide anything. I told myself I was being stupid, then opened my phone camera, tilting it along the edges, the way people do when they want proof instead of fear. That's when I saw it, a tiny red dot hovering just over my shoulder in the mirror's surface, steady like a standby LED. I spun around. Nothing. I looked back. The dot stayed put. It wasn't on the mirror. It was behind it. I called for Mara. She showed up in the doorway with a grocery bag, and an impatient look that vanished the second she saw my face. I pointed. "Do you see that?" She squinted. "Okay. Yeah. What is that?" I tapped the mirror. The sound was dull, heavy. I slid my fingers under the bottom edge and pulled. The mirror lifted an inch and a cold draft slipped out, smelling like damp wood. Together we lifted again, and the mirror swung outward on hidden hinges, silent and smooth like it had been opened 100 times. Behind it was a narrow cavity, unfinished wood, a little shelf and a cheap camera aimed through a hole aligned perfectly with the glass. Next to it sat an old black phone with a cracked screen still charging. My brain stalled, then snapped to the only explanation that fit this wasn't decor. It was a viewing station. Mara backed away, hands up. "Put it back," she whispered, like the mirror had turned into a weapon. I grabbed the phone anyway. The lock screen wallpaper was a photo of this exact cabin in summer, taken from the driveway. Under it were notification previews. I barely had to read. Live view bathroom mirror. Motion detected. Recording saved. I opened the camera app. No password. The live feed popped up, grainy and greenish, showing the bathroom from above me and Mara, standing there, trapped inside the frame. A timestamp sat in the corner today, minutes ago. Below it was a list of saved clips. I tapped the newest. The bathroom was empty for a few seconds. Then a man slid into view from the right tall hoodie up, moving like he knew where the camera couldn't see. He stopped in front of the mirror right where I'd just been, tilted his head as if listening, then pressed his palm to the glass from the inside. He leaned close enough that the camera caught the pale oval of his face and the glint of one eye. Then he smiled, slow and private, and stepped back out of frame. The clip ended. Mara started crying in short, furious bursts. My stomach turned because the timestamp wasn't days old. It was 40 minutes ago, before we arrived, which meant he'd been here today setting this up, waiting for someone to rent the place and believe the word private. I dropped the phone back onto the shelf like it burned. We swung the mirror shut, and it clicked into place seamless again, the perfect illusion restored. Mara grabbed my sleeve. Keys. No. We ran to the front door, boots half on coats, unzipped hands, clumsy with panic. I punched in the keypad code. Red beep. Incorrect. Again. Incorrect. Mara's voice. Crack. He changed it. I slammed my shoulder into the door. It didn't move. The deadbolt was engaged from the inside. From the hallway came a slow scrape, like a fingernail on wood, followed by a gentle knock. Not on the door. On the wall. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Outside the wind rose, swallowing the sound of our breathing. The knocking came again, closer now. Not from the wall, but from inside the bathroom, from behind that mirror. A man's voice spoke through the drywall, as if we were neighbors. Don't touch my things, it said. Not angry. Not loud. Just certain. I scanned the living room for anything that looked like it could hide a spare key, because every remote rental has one for emergencies. I tore a framed photo off the wall by the back door. Behind it, taped to the drywall, was an envelope. Inside, a single metal key, and a note that said in neat handwriting, "For emergencies only." I jammed the key into the back door. Deadbolt. It turned. The door opened and the cold hit like punishment. We ran straight to the car, snow up to our shins, adrenaline keeping us upright. I yanked the driver's door open and froze. The cabin's cracked black foam was sitting on my passenger seat, perfectly centered like it had been placed there for a photo. The air inside the car was warmer than it should have been. Mara whispered, "He was in here." My hands shook so hard I dropped my keys once, then found them and shoved them into the ignition. The engine started, but when I threw it into reverse, the car didn't move. I looked down and saw the parking brake was engaged hard. I hadn't touched it. Mara hadn't been in the car. I released it, and the car rolled back an inch, then stopped again, tires spinning uselessly. The driveway wasn't just snowy. It had been packed down and iced over, like someone had walked it, watered it, and let it freeze. Like someone had prepared it. Behind us, the cabin porch light held steady, like nothing was wrong. I didn't wait to get unstuck. We bailed out of the car and ran down the lane on foot, slipping, catching each other, not daring to look back. I tried calling 911 anyway, but the call kept dropping, one bar flickering like a taunt. We ran until the lane spilled onto the county road, lungs burning snow soaking our jeans. At the mailbox, a plastic sleeve hung under the flag like a message meant for us. Mara tore it open and read 2 words in neat block letters. "Smile for me." My phone buzzed immediately with a photo message from an unknown number. It was a grainy overhead shot of us in the bathroom, faces tipped up toward the mirror in pure panic. The timestamp said, "Now." That was when I understood the ugliest part. Whoever watched from that mirror could still see us even after we left the cabin. Across the road, deep in the tree line, a tiny red light blinked, once steady patient. The same dot I'd seen hovering in the glass. Then it blinked again, like an eye closing. A vehicle engine rumbled somewhere nearby, and for a second my blood turned to ice because I expected headlights and the slow roll of a truck coming to collect what had wandered off. Instead, an old plow truck passed without slowing, the driver never looking our way, just another person in the world who had no idea. My phone buzzed one last time. You looked right at me. I like that. The first face showed up like a mistake, the kind you blame on bad lighting, and an overactive imagination. We were playing cards at the cabin's dining table, the only bright spot in all that snow. The fireplace was doing its best, popping and hissing, and the wind kept leaning on the walls hard enough to make the picture frames twitch. It was our first night, and we'd been proud of ourselves for finding a winter getaway that didn't cost a fortune, remote, quiet, private. By 9, the blizzard had erased the driveway and turned the windows into dark mirrors, so the living room felt like the only safe room left on Earth. Mara got up to refill her drink, walked past the big picture window and stopped so abruptly her glass clinked against the counter. She didn't scream. She didn't even speak. She just froze one hand, hovering in the air, staring at the glass like it had just spoken her name. I followed her gaze and saw it a pale oval pressed against the outside of the window right at eye level where a person would stand if they were inches from the house. For half a second my brain tried to make it a reflection. Our own faces, the lamp behind us. But the angle was wrong. This face was looking in. It wasn't detailed like a movie monster. It was worse, human blurred by condensation with a smudge where a nose flattened against glass. Then the wind gusted, the curtains fluttered, and the face was gone, replaced by nothing but darkness and drifting snow. Mara whispered, "Did you see that?" And I hated how small her voice sounded in the warm room. I walked to the window and pressed my palm against the inside. The glass was cold enough to sting. Outside, there was nothing but the yard and the tree line black and unmoving. I told myself it was a trick of snow and shadow. I told myself someone would have to leave footprints. I told myself 100 things and none of them made my heart slow down. Minutes passed while we pretended we hadn't seen anything. Then the face came back. This time not as a blur, but as a set of features emerging from the dark, like a photo developing. Forehead, eyes, cheekbones. Pressed so close, the breath fogged a circle on the glass. The eyes were open and unblinking, staring past our reflections like we were the ones behind the window. Mara's hand found mine and gripped hard. I stepped forward and the face slid sideways, out of view, smooth and silent, like it had been expecting me to move. That's when I noticed something on the glass that hadn't been there before. A faint smear, as if someone's lips or forehead had left oil behind. And below it, 2 handprints' fingers splayed the marks slightly higher than the face, like whoever it was had been bracing themselves to press in harder. Mara whispered, "Who stands outside in a blizzard and does that?" I grabbed my phone and tried calling the sheriff's non-emergency line. No signal. Not even one bar. The cabin Wi-Fi was up, but every app spun and failed, like the internet was miles away too. The wind hit again, and the window rattled. For a split second, the glass reflected the room so perfectly, I saw us trapped in warm light, and outside I saw movement. Several shapes. I killed the living room lamp, and the window turned into a dark screen, revealing the yard. There, along the edge of the porch light's reach, were silhouettes. At least 3 standing still, spaced out like they'd arranged themselves. No waving. No running. Just watching. Mara whispered, "No, no, no," over and over, and I realized she'd seen them too. I turned the lamp back on, and the silhouettes vanished into reflection again, but I knew they were out there because the fear didn't vanish with them. A soft sound came from outside. A single knock on the glass. Not a bang. A polite tap, like someone asking to be let in. Then another tap a few inches away, and another as if multiple fingers were testing different spots. I backed away from the window. Mara backed away with me. The cabin suddenly felt smaller because of the attention pressing in from outside. Another face appeared higher up, almost at the top of the window, like a tall person or someone standing on something. Then another face lower near the couch height. 2 breath circles bloomed on the glass at the same time. Mara started to cry silently, and I found myself thinking something absurdly practical. If they're close enough to fog the window, they're close enough to hear us. I forced my voice into something steady and shouted, "Go away." The faces didn't react. They just pressed harder. The glass creaked faintly, a low complaint, and the handprints on the outside became clearer, the fingers whitening with pressure. Then, from the direction of the woods came a whistle. One long note, then two short ones, like a signal between people who had done this before. The faces withdrew in perfect unison, leaving the fog circles and smears behind, like evidence. For a moment the yard was empty. Then the porch light went out. Not flickered. Off, as if someone had reached up and unscrewed the bulb. Inside our cabin light suddenly felt like a spotlight. I rushed to the hallway and flipped the switch for the exterior light. Nothing. I flipped it again. Nothing. Mara grabbed a kitchen knife. I grabbed the fireplace poker. From outside, very close to the window, a voice spoke, soft, almost curious. "You can see us, right?" My blood went cold because the voice wasn't muffled by wind. It was right there, inches away through the glass, and it sounded young, almost playful. Mara shook her head violently at me, begging me not to respond. I didn't. I couldn't. Another face rose into view, but this one wasn't pale. It was covered in something dark that could have been mud or a mask, and it leaned so close, the nose flattened against the glass. The mouth moved, forming words we couldn't hear over the wind. Then the person smiled, and the smile didn't reach the eyes. The power blinked once. The TV cut out. The lights dimmed. The cabin made a low groan as the furnace faltered. In the brief half-dark, the window became less reflective, and I saw them again. Not 3 or 4, but more clustered along the porch shapes, packed close like an audience. A dozen breath circles appeared, and appeared, and faded, as if they were taking turns exhaling on the glass. Mara whispered, "They're not leaving." And I realized she was right, because the waiting was the point. I looked at the front door, at the thin line under it, where cold air slipped in. I imagined opening it, and stepping into that crowd of quiet faces. Then the whistle came again closer, now followed by a sound like wood, scraping wood, something being dragged across the porch boards. Through the lower part of the window I saw the edge of it, a long plank pulled into place directly in front of the door, like a barricade built from the outside. They weren't trying to get in. They were making sure we couldn't get out. Then came the gentle click of a camera shutter twice, as if someone was collecting proof. My phone buzzed impossibly with one weak bar of signal, returning just long enough for a message to arrive from an unknown number. "Don't waste the heat," screaming. And as the screen lit my face, the window filled again, not with one face, but with many, pressed close together, cheeks and foreheads flattening against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking, as if the woods had decided to look in all, at once. I thought the worst part of renting a remote cabin in winter would be the dry black ice. Blind turns the feeling that one wrong skid would erase you from the map. I was wrong. The worst part was realizing someone could stand out there in the trees and the snow for hours, and you wouldn't be sure whether you were being hunted or studied. We'd booked a 2-night stay for our anniversary, just me and Mara, a little A-frame with big windows facing the woods. The listing bragged about panoramic forest views, which sounds romantic until you're the one on display. By late afternoon the blizzard started to settle in. The sky turned the color of dirty wool and the tree line became a smudge. Inside, everything was warm. Wood stove, popping soup, simmering. The kind of cozy you pay extra for. Mara was taking pictures of the snow piled on the railing when she stopped mid-sentence and went quiet. Her phone lowered slowly. "Babe," she said, and there was something in her voice I'd never heard before. Small, careful, like she was talking near a sleeping animal. I walked to the window and followed her stare to the edge of the yard, where the porch light died and the woods began. At first, I thought it was a stump. Then I noticed it was the wrong shape. Too straight. Too tall. A person stood at the tree line, maybe 60 yards away, half swallowed by falling snow. He wasn't waving. He wasn't moving. He was just there. A dark coat, hood-up hands at his sides. No flashlight. No reflective tape. Nothing that suggested lost hiker or neighbor checking on you. He looked like a silhouette someone forgot to erase. I waited for him to shift his weight or turn his head. He didn't. Maybe it's a hunter, I said, because my brain needed the simplest label it could grab. Mara shook her head. Hunters don't stand still like that. I tried to zoom in with my phone camera, but the snow blurred him into pixels. When I raised my eyes again, he was still in the same spot, perfectly steady, like the storm couldn't touch him. We turned off the inside lamp, so the windows wouldn't act like mirrors. Without the reflection, the yard looked deeper, darker, and he looked closer, even though he hadn't moved. I opened the rental app to message the host, but the Wi-Fi stuttered, and my cell service was a single bar that flickered like a dare. Could be the owner, Mara whispered. Checking the property. That would have been comforting if he'd acted like a normal owner. Normal owners text. Normal owners knock. Normal owners don't watch you from the trees in a blizzard. I did what people do when they're trying to stay rational. I gave it 5 minutes, then 10, then 20. He stayed. At the half-hour mark, the cozy cabin turned into a fishbowl. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, telling myself I was going to be assertive, not reckless. The cold hit like a punch. Wind shoved snow into my face. I aimed the beam toward the treeline. The light cut a bright tunnel through the snowfall and landed on him, finally giving me detail. Not a stump, not a shadow. A man. Pale face. Hood up, eyes fixed on the cabin. He didn't flinch at the light. He didn't raise a hand to shield his eyes. It was like he wanted to be seen. "Hey," I shouted. "Can I help you?" No answer. I tried again, louder. "This is private property. You need to leave." He remained still for another beat, and then slowly, he lifted one hand. For one stupid second, I thought it was a wave. It wasn't. He pointed not at me, but at the cabin itself, at the window behind me, like he was indicating something inside. My throat tightened. I glanced back through the glass. Mara stood in the living room, frozen her hand over her mouth, staring past me at the tree line. When I turned back, the man's hand was lowered again, and he was still watching. I went inside and locked the deadbolt, then shoved a chair under the knob even though it wouldn't matter against a determined person. We told ourselves we'd call the sheriff as soon as we got service. We told ourselves he'd get bored. We told ourselves the storm would force him to leave. An hour passed. The man stayed. 2 hours passed. The man stayed. The blizzard thickened until the yard was a white blur, yet somehow his outline remained anchored to that same place, like a pin in a map. At some point, the strangest thought slid into my head. What if he isn't standing there the whole time? What if he's leaving and coming back, and I just keep catching him there? To calm myself, I set my phone on the windowsill and recorded video. Aimed at the tree line, then watched the screen instead of the yard, because it felt safer to observe him through glass and pixels. 10 minutes in, Mara whispered. He moved. I looked up. The tree line was empty. Then Mara pointed down and left toward the narrow strip of yard between the window and the woods. He wasn't at the tree line anymore. He was halfway across the yard, still standing perfectly straight, still silent, still looking at the cabin. "I didn't see him walk," Mara said. "I swear I didn't see him walk." I checked the video. The frame showed snow yard woods. And then, between one moment and the next, his silhouette was simply closer. No stride, no approach, just a change in distance, like a cut in a movie. My hands went numb. We backed away from the window, and in the process, Mara's elbow bumped the curtain. It shifted, exposing more glass. The man's head tilted slightly, as if he'd been waiting for that. Then the porch light went out. Not flicker out, like someone had turned it off, at the switch. The cabin's interior suddenly felt too bright, like we were under interrogation. I killed the living room lights, leaving only the fire. In the dim, the window turned into a dark screen, and the man became more visible. Closer now, close enough that I could make out the wet shine of his coat and the pale smear of his face beneath the hood. He lifted his hand again and tapped something against his thigh. He caught the firelight for a second, a set of keys. Keys that clinked softly even through the glass, even through the wind. Mara whispered, "How does he have keys?" That was when my phone buzzed with a notification from the rental app. One message finally slipping through the weak Wi-Fi. It was from the host. Please do not go outside after dark. The woods get strange. I typed back with shaking thumbs. Someone is outside. Call the police. The message failed. The man took one slow step forward. I saw that step clearly, this time the crunch of snow under boot, the shift of weight. And then he stopped again right at the edge of the porch, steps just beyond the reach of the firelight. He stared at the door, like he could see through it. Then he raised his other hand, and very carefully pressed one finger to his lips. Sure. Mara started to sob the sound, breaking loose, no matter how hard she tried to hold it in. The man's head turned toward the side of the cabin, toward the bedroom window. And in that moment I understood exactly why he'd been standing at the tree line for hours. He wasn't waiting for us to notice him. He was waiting for us to get tired. He was waiting for the moment we stopped watching the glass. Because when Mara and I finally turned away to grab our coats and run, we heard it soft, deliberate. Something sliding across the porch boards like a plank being dragged into place. And then the front door handle jiggled, once gently testing. Not to get in. To let us know he could. The first time I noticed the smoke detector, it wasn't because it was beeping or because we were burning dinner. It was because a tiny green light blinked at me from the ceiling, like it was checking if I was watching back. We were on the second night of a winter rental. Different cabin, different host, same promise. Remote private, perfect for a reset. By this point, I was jumpy about everything. The kind of jumpy you get when you've learned that secluded can be a marketing word for no one hears you. Mara laughed at me for counting the windows and testing the locks, but her laugh kept thinning every time the wind hit the walls. The cabin was modern. All reclaimed wood and black metal fixtures, the kind of place that costs extra because it looks good on Instagram. There was a smart thermostat, a smart TV, a smart lock, even a smart speaker in the kitchen that greeted us with a chirpy voice as soon as we walked in. Welcome, it said. Enjoy your stay. At first it felt convenient. Then it started to feel like a lot of things in this cabin were listening. After dinner, Mara went to shower. I stayed in the living room, scrolling aimlessly, half watching the fire. That's when I saw the blink. One soft green pulse from the smoke detector above the hallway. Too steady, too deliberate. Most detectors have a red LED, a slow, boring heartbeat. This was green, and it blinked twice, paused, then blinked once, like a signal. I stood under it and stared. The blink stopped. I waited. Nothing. I stepped back toward the couch. Blink, blink, pause, blink. My skin prickled. I grabbed a chair, climbed up, and brought my face close to the plastic housing. That's when I saw it. A pinhole that wasn't part of the design, perfectly centered between the vents, the kind of pinhole you'd only notice if you were looking for a reason to be afraid. I told myself it was a sensor, a vent, a manufacturing floor. Then I noticed the rim around it, tiny, glassy, reflecting my eye back at me. A lens. Mara called from the bathroom. Everything okay? I didn't want to answer honestly because I didn't want to put the fear into the air. Yeah, I said, and my voice cracked anyway. When she came out, hair wet, towel wrapped around her, I pointed up. Look at that. Tell me I'm crazy. She squinted, then her face changed in the same slow way it always does when denial runs out of room. That's not... she started. That's not normal. I twisted the detector gently. It didn't budge. It was mounted tight, like it had never been removed. There was a little notch on the side. I slid a butter knife into it and popped the cover off with a soft click. Inside was not a normal smoke detector circuit board, not just a battery and a buzzer. There was a tiny camera module glued to the plastic, a ribbon cable running to a board no bigger than a credit card, and a micro SD card seated like a secret. Mara's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God. I had a tiny card reader in my bag. I snapped the micro SD in, and a folder opened, labeled by room, Whole Living Master. The newest file was timestamped 5 minutes ago, and the thumbnail was my face staring up at the ceiling. Below it were other nights, people sleeping, people changing clothes. I pulled the microSD out and held it like it might bite. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped it. It could be for security, Mara whispered, as if that would make it okay. In the hallway, pointed at the bedroom doors, I said, "Security for who?" We found another detector in the living room. Same pinhole. Same green blink. Another in the master bedroom. Another in the guest room. 4 cameras all aimed at where people slept, changed clothes, walked barefoot at night. The cabin suddenly felt less like a rental and more like a set built to capture footage. I wanted to grab our bags and leave immediately, but outside the blizzard had returned, white noise swallowing the world, and the road in was a single-lane ribbon that disappeared into trees. "We still leave," Mara said. "We leave anyway." I agreed, but my brain kept snagging on one question. If these were recording, where was the feed going? There was a router on a shelf by the TV, labeled with the Wi-Fi name we'd been using. I unplugged it. The smart speaker in the kitchen chirped once like it was offended. Then from above us the smoke detector blinked faster. Blink, 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 like it was panicking. My phone buzzed, with a notification from the rental app. "Host everything okay, your internet just went offline." I stared at the message. We hadn't messaged him. We hadn't called. The only thing that changed was the router, Mara whispered. "He's watching live." I plugged the router back in for 1 second just to see what would happen, then opened my phone's network settings. A new Wi-Fi network appeared that hadn't been there before. Cabin, admin, hidden network, strong signal. My stomach dropped. There was a back door, a separate system, something the host used that guests never saw. I unplugged the router again, then yanked the power strip out of the wall, then ripped the smart speaker cord free like it was a snake. For a heartbeat, the cabin was quiet, in a way it hadn't been all night. No little device chimes. No invisible attention. Just wind in the fire, and our breathing. Then the thermostat screen lit up on its own, and displayed a single word. "Hello." Mara backed into me. "No. Nope. We're leaving." We threw clothes into bags with shaking hands. I didn't bother folding. I didn't bother finding things. I just wanted the door. Mara punched in the smart lock code to open it. The keypad flashed red. Code invalid. She tried again. Red. Again. Red. I tried my code. Same result. The lock made a soft clicking sound, like it was enjoying itself. Then the smart speaker, even though I'd unplugged it, spoke from the kitchen in a tinny whisper, like a voice leaking through a wall. "Please do not tamper with safety equipment." My blood turned cold. "We're calling the police," I said, and pulled my phone out. No service. The Wi-Fi was dead. The world outside the cabin might as well have been the moon. Mara started crying, not loud, just shaking the sound of someone trying not to feed the thing that's feeding on them. I ran to the back door. It had a deadbolt too. Locked. I checked the windows. They were large and sealed, the kind that don't open because the view is the selling point. Up above, the smoke detector blinked once, slow and satisfied. Then a soft sound came from the hallway ceiling, like plastic settling like someone touching the casing. I grabbed the chair again and climbed up rage, rising over fear. I ripped the camera module out with my fingers snapping the ribbon cable. The smart lock on the front door clicked. Once. Twice. Like it was resetting. The thermostat went dark. The cabin's lights flickered. And then, from the darkness beyond the living room window, a phone flashlight turned on for a second, aimed directly at us, framing our bodies in the glass like targets. The light clicked off. A moment later, our phones buzzed at the same time, with the same incoming message. Somehow pushing through with no service put it back. I stared up at the ceiling where the camera had been. I stared at Mara's terrified face. And I realized the worst part wasn't the hidden lenses. It was that whoever installed them was close enough to watch us react in real time, and he was patient enough to wait until we understood there was nowhere private left to hide. At 3:07 a.m., the scream didn't sound like an animal. It didn't have that wild, ragged edge you hear in nature videos, and it didn't rise and fall the way coyotes do when they're trying to confuse you. It sounded human in the most specific way possible. A single long cry that broke into a choke halfway through, like lungs giving up. Mara sat bolt upright on the couch so fast, the blanket fell to the floor. I had been half asleep with my phone in my hand, the screen dark, the battery already bleeding down in the cold. The cabin was otherwise quiet. No TV, no music, just the furnace cycling and the wind worrying the roof. Then the scream came again closer, and the hairs on my arms lifted, because it wasn't coming from the road. It was coming from the woods, from that black wall of trees beyond the windows. Mara whispered my name, like she was asking permission to panic. I got up and killed the lamp, so the glass wouldn't reflect us back. Without the light, the windows stopped being mirrors and turned into open mouths. Outside snow fell in slow sheets through the porch light's weak glow, and beyond that glow was pure dark. A third scream ripped through the night, and this one had words inside it. Not clear words, but syllables, shaped like language. Someone trying to say something through pain. Mara grabbed my wrist. "That's a person," she said. "We have to call someone." I tried. One bar flickered and died. I turned Wi-Fi calling on. It spun and failed. The rental's internet was still up, but everything important, emergency call, messaging, anything that could reach outside kept stalling like the cabin was a bubble. The scream came again, and this time it ended abruptly, like a hand had covered a mouth. The silence after was so complete, it felt staged. Mara's eyes were huge. "Did you hear that stop?" she whispered. I nodded, because my throat had tightened too much for words. We stood there in the dark living room, staring through glass, like it could do something other than let us watch. Then, from farther left in the woods, came another scream. Same voice, same pitch, same desperate break, like whatever was out there had been moved, dragged, or carried. That's when Mara started shaking. "Someone's taking them," she said, and the idea hit me like a cold plunge. This wasn't just a random sound. It was a sequence. It was happening around us. I grabbed the fireplace poker, because it was the only heavy thing I could hold without thinking, and I cracked the front door open 2 inches, just enough to listen with my whole body. The wind shoved in immediately icy and loud, and the porch boards groaned under shifting snow. In that narrow gap, the woods sounded closer, like they were leaning in, too. A scream came again, and I felt it in my chest more than my ears. Mara hissed, "Don't go out." I wanted to believe there was a right answer here, something heroic you do in movies, but all I could picture was stepping off the porch and vanishing into that dark, leaving Mara alone in a cabin full of windows. I shut the door and locked it, then locked it again, like repetition could change physics. We moved room to room, checking windows, trying to spot movement, any shape, any flashlight beam. Nothing. Then at 319, we heard it footsteps. Not outside, inside. Soft, almost polite, coming from the hallway that led to the bedrooms. Mara froze so hard she didn't even breathe. I swung the poker up and stared down the hall. The darkness there was thicker like the firelight. Didn't want to travel. "Hello," I called, and my voice sounded embarrassingly normal, like I was calling to a neighbor, not to whatever had decided to join the night. No answer. The footsteps stopped. Then the scream came again, not from the woods this time, but from somewhere much closer. Close enough that the windows vibrated faintly. Mara grabbed my arm so hard, it hurt. "It's outside," she whispered. I turned my head toward the glass, and saw, for the first time, a tiny point of light in the trees bobbing slightly. A headlamp, or a phone flashlight, held low. It moved between trunks in a slow, deliberate path, not the wandering sweep of someone lost, but the controlled motion of someone searching. The light stopped, then angled toward the cabin, and for 1 second the beam hit our window dead on, turning us into silhouettes in our own living room. The light cut off instantly, as if whoever held it didn't want us to see where they were. In the dark that followed, the next scream came out of nowhere, right at the edge of the porch light's reach. And this time it said something clear enough to make my stomach drop. My name dragged out in a broken, pleading voice. "Ethan!" it cried, and the sound was so close, so perfectly shaped that my brain tried to stand up and run to it before fear yanked the leash. Mara whispered, "That's not real. That's not real," like a prayer. The scream came again, and it said her name. Murder. Same voice. Same broken plea. Same exact cadence like someone had practiced it. That's when I understood the trap. It wasn't just that someone might be hurt out there. It was that something out there knew what would pull us out of the cabin. I backed away from the windows, pulling Mara with me, and we sat on the floor behind the couch. The lowest point in the room, like height, made you visible. We stayed there for what felt like hours, listening to the woods perform screams, drifting nearer, then farther, cutting off, suddenly starting again from another direction, always just plausible enough to make you question your own humanity. Around 4:00 a.m., the screams stopped completely. The wind kept blowing. The fire kept popping. The cabin kept being a cabin, but the silence felt like a hand resting on the back of your neck. When morning finally came, grey and weak, we opened the door and stepped onto the porch with numb legs and eyes that burned from not blinking. The snow around the steps was untouched except for one thing, placed dead center on the welcome mat. A small handheld speaker, cheap plastic still wet, with snow, its power light blinking calmly, as if it had been working all night. Next to it was a folded note inside a zip-top bag. 2 words, in neat block letters, "Good listeners." The knock came at 6:42 p.m., right when the daylight was draining out of the sky and the woods were becoming a single dark mass again. We had spent the day trying to act normal, after the night of screams, telling ourselves it was teenagers, a cruel prank, an animal sound loop, anything that didn't require us to accept how targeted it felt. The storm had eased, but the temperature dropped, freezing the slush into glass. The driveway looked like a hard white tongue leading nowhere. When the knock came, it was firm and official. 3 hits spaced evenly like someone trained to do it that way. Mara and I both froze, and then she whispered, "Don't answer." Another knock. Then a voice, muffled by the door, calm and practiced. "Ranger, service. We need to speak with the occupants." My first instinct was relief so sharp it made my eyes sting. A ranger meant someone knew we were here. Someone with authority. Someone who could explain the screams, check the area, escort us out if the road was bad. I moved toward the door, then stopped because Mara's hand clamped on my arm. "Ask for badge," she whispered. I didn't know why her brain went there first, but I listened anyway, because her fear had been right too many times. I called through the door, "Can you show ID?" There was a short pause, then the same calm voice, "Of course. Open up and I'll show you." The answer was wrong in a way that's hard to explain. Real officials don't push you to open a door in a remote cabin at dusk during winter. They hold up ID through a window. They call ahead. They don't sound annoyed by basic caution. I peered through the side window by the door, the narrow pane that gave you a slice of porch. A man stood there in a dark jacket and a brimmed cap dusted with snow. He wasn't wearing the bright reflective outerwear you see on actual park employees. His pants were plain. His boots were too clean. In his hands he held something like a clipboard, but he kept it angled away from the glass. The porch light hit his face and I couldn't place his age. Could have been 30, could have been 50, because his expression was too controlled, like he was wearing neutral as a mask. Behind him, parked at the edge of the drive, was a truck. No markings, no light bar, just a dark vehicle idling with its headlights off, like it didn't want to announce itself. "We receive reports of unsafe activity in this area," he said through the door. "We need to come inside and confirm you're okay." Mara whispered, "No." I swallowed and tried to sound steady. "If you're a ranger, you can show your badge to the window." Another pause, just long enough for irritation to seep through his calm. "Ma'am," he said, and my blood chilled because he wasn't looking at me when he said it. His eyes were aimed slightly right at the living room window, as if he could see Mara's outline behind me. "It's colder than you think tonight. Open the door so we can get this done." Mara didn't move. She didn't make a sound. The man's gaze returned to the side window, and he smiled a little, like we were slowing him down but not stopping him. "Your host asked us to check," he added. There were noises last night. I felt my stomach drop because that meant he knew. He knew about the screams. Or he was using them. I asked, "What's your name?" He exhaled through his nose, impatient. "Ranger Collins," he said. "Now open up." Mara mouthed, "Lie." I didn't know how she knew, but again, I listened. I pulled my phone out and opened the camera, aiming it at the side window to record him. The screen showed his face, the brim of the cap, the shadow of his jacket. And then, as if he sensed the phone, he stepped 1 inch to the left, just enough that the window frame cut off the view of his hands. "We can do this the easy way," he said softly, and there was something underneath his tone, now a mild amusement like he was talking to a child. The smart lock on the door beeped once. Not from my touch, from outside. The keypad lit up digits flashing, and I realized with a jolt that he was entering codes, trying combinations. The lock beeped again, then again faster now, like a machine getting annoyed. Mara backed up, whispering, "He has the code." The man laughed, once quiet and humorless. "You really shouldn't rent places out here," he said. And for the first time he leaned closer to the door, close enough that I could see his breath fog the small window. "People forget there are no witnesses in the woods." I raised my voice. "We're calling the police." He tilted his head, listening to the silence of no service. "Sure," he said, and then he did something small that made the air leave my lungs. He said my full name. Not Ethan. My full name, the one tied to reservations and IDs. Then he said Mara's. "Open the door," he repeated. "Gentle now, or I'll wait until you get tired again." Mara made a sound like she was swallowing a scream. I stepped back from the door and shouted, "Leave. Now." The man's smile faded into something flat. He turned his head slightly toward the truck like he was checking for something, then looked back at the window and held up what he'd been keeping, angled away, a bad-shaped piece of metal that could have been anything in the dim light. He didn't press it to the glass. He didn't let me focus on it. He just flashed it, the way a magician flashes a coin. "There," he said, "happy." Then he lowered it and added almost kindly, "Last chance." I didn't respond. Mara didn't respond. The man stood still for a long beat, eyes fixed on the cabin like he was memorizing it. Then he stepped down off the porch, slow, unhurried. He walked to the truck, got in, and started it without turning on the headlights. The vehicle rolled forward, crunching softly over ice, and disappeared around the bend of the lane like it had never been there. For 5 minutes we didn't move. For 10, we didn't breathe right. Finally, I crept to the window and looked at the driveway. The truck's tracks were their dark lines in the snow, but they didn't point away from the cabin. They formed a loop, circling the property once slow and deliberate, before heading back into the trees. Like he'd taken a lap to make sure we understood he could come and go without using the road. When we finally worked up the nerve to open the door, there was something wedged into the frame where it would fall onto the floor the moment the seal broke. A laminated card, glossy like an official notice. On the front was the cabin's listing photo. On the back, in neat block letters, it said, "Next time I'll bring a badge you can read." If you ever hear a whistle answer you from a forest that has no reason to know you exist, do not whistle again. I learned that the hard way in a cabin that looked harmless in daylight. The kind of rental with a neat gravel drive and a little sign over the door that said "Welcome Home" like the woods could be domesticated with a cute font. Mara and I had arrived. Before sunset, unpacked, started a fire, tried to forget the last place that left us jumpy and suspicious. We told ourselves we were overreacting, that you can't live in fear of every creak and shadow, or you might as well never leave the city. The first few hours were quiet, almost normal, until the wind picked up and the trees began to tap the roof like fingernails. Mara went to bed early with a book. I stayed up pacing, checking locks out of habit, pretending it was just responsible. At around 11, I stepped onto the porch for air, because the cabin smelled too much like smoke and anxiety. The cold slapped me awake. The yard was a flat sheet of snow under moonlight, and beyond it the tree line stood black and tight, a wall with no gaps. To calm myself, I did something stupidly human. I whistled a little tune my grandfather used to whistle when he couldn't sleep. 3 notes up, 2 down. a gentle loop that always made me think of summer. The sound barely carried before the wind stole it. I felt ridiculous and started to turn back inside. Then a whistle came back. Same rhythm. Same rise and fall. From the woods, not loud, not faint, perfectly balanced, as if the person whistling stood at exactly the distance needed to make it feel like a reply. My body went cold in a different way than the weather. I stood very still, listening. The wind moved through branches. The porch light hummed. Nothing else. I told myself it was a neighbor, a hiker, someone playing games. But no one was supposed to be out there, and the listing bragged about total isolation. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to laugh it off. Mara looked up from her book and asked why my face was white. I said nothing, just the wind. I didn't tell her about the whistle because I didn't want to hand Fear a microphone. Around midnight, after we'd turned off most of the lights, I heard it again, softer this time, like it had moved closer to the cabin without using footsteps. The tune drifted through the living room window, that same little loop, only now there was an extra note, a wrong note, slipped in, like a grin. Mara sat up in bed and said, "Do you hear that?" Her voice was tight. I nodded. The whistle stopped the moment she spoke, as if it had been listening for our reaction. We lay there in the dark for a long time, holding our breath like the woods might count it. When nothing else happened, we almost convinced ourselves it was nothing. Then at 1:23, the whistle came back, not from outside, but from inside the cabin. It was muffled as if traveling through a pipe or a wall, but it was unmistakable. 3 notes up, 2 down, the wrong extra note lingering at the end. Mara grabbed my arm and whispered, "That's in here." I got up barefoot on cold wood and followed the sound to the kitchen. It seemed to come from above the cabinets, near the vent hood. I climbed onto a chair and pressed my ear to the wall. The whistle faded, then resumed on the other side of the room, like it was moving without moving, choosing new exits. I checked the windows. Locked. Curtains drawn. The front door dead-bolted. The back door latched. The cabin had no attic access. We could find no basement door, no obvious crawlspace hatch. And still the whistle threaded through the walls with the calm patience of someone who knew the layout better than we did. Mara stood behind me, holding her phone like a weapon, tears shining in her eyes. "Stop," she whispered to me, or to it, I couldn't tell. I tried something I regret admitting because it proves how quickly fear makes you childish. I whistled back the exact tune as perfectly as I could, to show I wasn't powerless, to show it didn't own the sound. The cabin went silent. For a few seconds I felt a surge of relief. Then a whistle answered from directly behind me, close enough that I felt the vibration in my ear. Same tune, but now it was flawless, cleaner than mine, like a recording played through a better speaker. Mara gasped. I spun. The living room was empty, but in the dark corner, by the coat hooks, the air seemed to hold the last note a beat too long, like someone had just stepped away. I backed toward Mara, and that's when her phone buzzed with a notification from the rental app, even though we had barely any service. The message was from the host. It read, "Please keep noise to a minimum after midnight. The neighbors can hear you." I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. There were no neighbors. There wasn't even a second cabin visible from the road. Mara whispered, "He heard you whistle." The idea that the host was listening in real time made my stomach turn, but it didn't explain the whistle inside the walls. Unless it did. We started tearing the place apart with shaking hands. Behind the TV, we found a small black box plugged into the router, labeled in tiny print, "Audio Extender." In the hallway, the smoke detector had that faint green blink again, like an eye. I climbed on the chair, popped it open, and inside was not just a detector. There was a small speaker disc glued beside a camera module, wired into a board that looked homemade. A speaker meant sound could travel both ways. Not just him watching us, but him talking, whistling, shaping what we heard from wherever he was. Mara's hands flew to her mouth. "So he can make it sound like it's outside," she whispered. "Or inside." The whistle returned immediately louder, now coming from multiple points at once, a chorus of the same tune layered slightly out of sync like it was surrounding us. Then, beneath the whistle, we heard something else. A faint scrape at the back door, metal on metal. like a key testing a lock. Mara started sobbing, shaking her head violently. I grabbed the fireplace poker and stepped toward the door, forcing myself to look through the small window. The porch light showed falling snow, and nothing else. But on the glass right at eye level, someone had drawn a symbol with a fingertip through the frost. Simple and childish. A circle with a line through it, like a crossed-out eye. The whistle stopped. For one beat, the cabin was silent. Then a voice came through the smart speaker in the kitchen, soft and amused, like a man speaking into a microphone. "Better," it said. "That tune is yours now." The back door handle jiggled once, slow and gentle testing. I didn't open it. I didn't shout. I didn't do anything dramatic. I stood there in the dim light with the poker in my hand, and I realized the point wasn't to get inside. The point was to teach us a lesson about attention, about how easy it is to make someone feel hunted with nothing but sound and timing. Mara sank to the floor, whispering, "We're leaving at first light." I nodded, and in the quiet that followed I heard the whistle one last time, not from the walls or the woods, but from my own phone, playing as a notification tone I had never set. 3 notes up, 2 down, and the wrong extra note at the end, like a signature. The first sign it was a cult was not the chanting. It was the way the woods went quiet, as if even the animals knew to lower their heads. Mara and I had driven to this cabin because it was supposed to be the safest kind of remote. A gated property, a long private lane, a host with dozens of glowing reviews about feeling protected. The listing included photos of deer in the yard, a fire pit under string lights, and a hot tub that looked like a promise. We arrived in the afternoon, checked the locks, made jokes about our own paranoia, and tried to reset. The weather was clear, but bitter, a dry cold that made your breath feel like smoke. By dusk, the treeline swallowed the last sunlight, and the cabin's big windows turned the woods into a black ocean. We were eating late plates on our laps when Mara muted the TV and said, "Listen." At first I heard nothing but the faint hiss of the radiator and the soft crackle of the fire. Then from far out in the woods came a low hum like many voices holding one note together. It was too steady to be wind, too organized to be animals. I stood and walked to the window, pressing my forehead to the cold glass. The porch light reached only a few yards, showing snow and a line of fence posts. Beyond that was darkness. The hum continued, and under it I began to hear syllables not clear enough for words, but shaped like repetition, like a group reciting something in unison. Mara whispered, "Is that singing?" My heart started to hammer, because it sounded exactly like what your brain labels as ritual when it doesn't have another category. I tried to tell myself it was a church group at a nearby lodge, a weird winter event, a local tradition, anything. But the sound wasn't coming from a road direction. It was deep in the woods, off-trail, where you wouldn't gather in winter unless you had a reason that made the cold irrelevant. I grabbed my phone and stepped onto the porch, not far, just enough to listen without glass between me and the night. The air was so cold it tightened my throat. The chanting was clearer outside, and it was coming from the left, where the woods dipped into a shallow valley. I could also see something I hadn't noticed through the window, a faint orange flicker between trunks, like firelight, hidden on purpose. Mara came to the door behind me, wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide. "Don't go," she said. I didn't, at least not toward the woods. I walked along the porch rail to get a better angle, and that's when I saw the trail. It started near the edge of the driveway where the snow was slightly packed, and it led off into the trees. Not random footprints. A narrow path, compressed by many feet, like people had been walking it back and forth for hours. It was fresh enough that the edges hadn't softened. Fresh enough that whatever group was out there had arrived after dark. I took one step down off the porch to inspect it, and the chanting paused abruptly, all at once, like a conductor had cut them off. The silence hit so hard it made my ears ring. I froze, with one boot on the step and one boot in the snow. Then from the woods, a single voice called out, clear and calm. "We see you." Mara made a small sound behind me, and I realized with horror that her blanket was bright white against the dark doorway, a perfect target. I grabbed her hand and pulled her inside, slamming the door and locking it. We killed the lights, leaving only the fire glow, then peeked through a small gap in the curtain. The orange flicker in the woods brightened. Shapes moved in front of it, a slow line of silhouettes, heads, hooded bodies bundled in dark clothing. They were not stumbling through snow like lost hikers. They moved with purpose, evenly spaced, as if following a practiced route. The chanting resumed quieter now, but closer. "Mara," whispered, "call the host." I tried. No service. The Wi-Fi symbol showed one bar, and then dropped. It felt like the cabin itself didn't want us to reach anyone. The silhouettes reached what had to be a clearing, because the firelight flared higher and illuminated them from below, in brief flashes, hands raised, faces turned inward. A circle. Something stood in the center, tall and narrow, like a post or a tree trunk stripped of branches. The group's voices rose and fell together, and my skin crawled because the cadence sounded like the children's games, where you chant and choose someone only slower, heavier, older. Mara squeezed my arm so hard it hurt. "They're going to come here," she whispered. I didn't know why she was sure, but as if the woods wanted to prove her right, the circle shifted. Several figures turned their heads at the same time toward the cabin, toward our windows, toward the small, warm square of human light. Even from that distance, the synchronized movement looked unnatural, like they had been waiting for a signal. The chanting stopped again. One figure broke from the circle and walked to the edge of the clearing, stepping into the faintest line of moonlight. They raised an arm and pointed not toward the road, not toward a trail, but directly toward our cabin. Then the group began to move, not running, not hurrying, just flowing into the trees, as if they knew the path by heart. The fire in the clearing dimmed behind them, either covered or left to burn low, and the woods swallowed the last bright proof that this was real. Mara whispered, "They're coming." The porch light suddenly went out, and the cabin felt exposed in the dark. A soft thud sounded against the front wall, followed by another, like someone gently setting something down. I forced myself to look through the peephole. At first, I saw only darkness. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw it a bundle on the porch, wrapped in cloth, placed neatly in front of the door like a delivery. Another bundle sat beside it. The chanting in the woods started up again now, much closer, threading between the trees like smoke. Mara was crying silently, shaking her head. I backed away from the door and whispered, "Do not open it." Another thud. A third bundle placed with care. Then from just beyond the porch, a voice spoke low and friendly, as if greeting neighbors. "A gift," it said, "for the warm house." I didn't respond. I didn't move. The voice continued, still gentle. "You can stay warm if you share." The chanting swelled, and I heard footsteps in the snow, many of them circling, not rushing the door, but spreading out around the cabin like a net. The worst part was how patient it felt, like they had the whole night, and we didn't. Mara whispered, "What's in the bundles?" I didn't want to know. But the question gnawed at me until I did something I shouldn't have. I lifted the corner of the curtain a fraction to look down at the porch through the living room window. In the dim light of the fire behind me, I could just make out what was tied to the top of the closest bundle, a strip of paper pinned like a tag. On it, in careful handwriting, were the words, "Welcome home." The same words from the sign above our door. My stomach turned because it meant someone had been close enough to read it, copy it, mock it. A shadow moved past the window, close, too close, and I flinched back. A moment later, the smart thermostat screen lit up on its own, and displayed a message in plain digital letters, "Open the door." Mara and I stared at it, and in that moment the idea of a cult became less about robes and candles, and more about control. They didn't need to break in. They only needed to convince you that the only way to survive the night was to do what they asked. Outside, the chanting softened into a whispering murmur, and the friendly voice returned nearer now, as if leaning toward the door. "We'll wait," it said. "We always do." I noticed the basement door because it was the only thing in the cabin that didn't want to be seen. The kitchen was bright, all white tile, and hanging copper pans staged to look like someone cooked there with joy instead of necessity. But the door sat low on the wall, beside the pantry painted the same eggshell color as the trim, so your door eyes slid right past it. If you weren't already on edge, you'd never look twice. We were on edge. Mara had spent the whole drive up repeating that we were done with remote but cozy rentals, that the next vacation would be somewhere with neighbors and a front desk and a lobby camera. And I kept agreeing even as I typed this cabin's POC code into the smart lock. The first hour was normal enough, heat on bags, down fire started. Then, while Mara unpacked, I heard a thump from the kitchen that didn't match the settling of wood. It was heavy, like a suitcase dropped from waist height. I went in and found nothing out of place, except that basement door had a faint new scuff at its bottom edge, as if someone had dragged something across it. I knelt, put my ear near the seam, and heard a soft, low sound from below, like water moving through a pipe that shouldn't be active. When I touched the knob, it was cold enough to sting colder than the rest of the wall. I tried it anyway. It didn't budge. That's when I saw the boards. 2 rough planks nailed across the door in an X, the head sunk deep and freshly shiny, like the nails had gone in recently. The boards weren't dusty. They weren't aged. They were new wood against old trim. A quiet, ugly correction. Mara came in behind me and said, "What are you doing?" And when I pointed, her face tightened the way it does when denial runs out of room. "Why would a basement be nailed shut?" she whispered. I didn't have a good answer. I messaged the host through the rental app. No reply. I tried calling. 1 bar, then none. The cabin's Wi-Fi was strong, but every message spun and failed like the internet was just a fake icon. Mara wanted to ignore it. "People seal basements," she said. "Mold. Flooding. Animals." But she said it too quickly, like she was reciting. Over the next hour, the house kept giving little signs that the door mattered. The floor near it was warmer than the rest of the kitchen, as if heat rose from below. The air along the seam carried a faint smell of damp earth, and underneath that, something older, like cold cigarette smoke trapped in fabric. And twice, when the furnace kicked on, I heard a muffled tap from behind the door, delayed by a second as if something down there reacted to the vibration. At dusk, the woods outside went purple, and the windows turned black. Mara and I sat by the fire, pretending to watch TV, but neither of us could stop glancing at the kitchen. At 9:18 p.m., the tapping returned. 3 slow knocks from inside the wall below the pantry shelf, not on the basement door itself, but close enough that it might as well have been. Mara's hand found mine and squeezed. I stood, grabbed the fireplace poker, and walked into the kitchen with my heart punching at my ribs. I pressed the poker tip lightly to the boards and listened. Another knock came closer to the door. Now, then a pause, then a drag, like fingernails on wood. I whispered, "Hello," which is the dumbest word in horror because it assumes the thing on the other side is interested in conversation. Silence answered for a beat, and then a voice, faint but clear, rose from behind the door. "Don't," it said. Not a shout, not a plea, a warning. Mara backed into the hallway, shaking her head. "We'll leave," she whispered. "Right now." I wanted to. But outside the wind had picked up, and the driveway was icing over. And the idea of slipping off a mountain road in the dark felt like choosing one danger over another. I told myself, we just needed clarity. If there's someone down there, we call for help, I said. If it's empty, we stop spiraling. Mara stared at me like I'd volunteered to open a coffin. I found a hammer in a drawer, because cabins always have one, and started prying at the first plank. The nails came out too easily, not rusted, not stubborn. Fresh work. Each pull made a small metallic squeal that echoed through the kitchen like a scream with its mouth covered. When the first board dropped, the air around the door changed, like something exhaled from below. The smell hit harder, damp wood, stale sweat, and that sour, sweet edge of something living in a space with no fresh air. Behind the second plank, I saw the door itself wasn't even latched in a normal way. The knob turned freely, but a heavy chain had been looped through the frame from the other side, drawn tight, as if someone wanted it shut, but didn't want to use a lock. Guests could open. "That's not to keep someone out," Mara said quietly. "That's to keep something in." My hands shook. I forced myself to yank the chain through the crack enough to slack it. It rattled, and from below came a sudden scramble fast, and panicked like bare feet on concrete. Mara whispered my name, and I hated that she sounded like she was saying goodbye. I pulled the door open. A steep set of wooden steps dropped into darkness. My phone flashlight caught dust, cobwebs, and the glint of something wet on the lower steps. Not water. Something darker streaked, like a hand had slid along the railing. I took one step down, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The basement wasn't finished. It was a packed dirt floor with low beams and a single bare bulb hanging from a cord. The bulb was off, but when my light swept across it, I saw the cord had been tied into a knot, as if someone had tugged it too hard too many times. In the corner was a mattress on the ground, covered with a sleeping bag. Beside it sat a milk crate with canned food and a plastic jug of water. Not dusty, not abandoned, used. And on the wall above the mattress, carved into the wood with something sharp, were tally marks, dozens of them arranged in groups of 5. Mara stayed on the top step, crying silently. I moved my light across the room, and froze when it landed on the far wall. There was another door down there, smaller, newer, cut into the foundation. A storm door, the kind you'd use for a root cellar, except there were fresh boot prints in the dirt leading to it, then smoothed over as if someone had tried to erase them. As I stared, the small door's handle shifted slightly on its own, not opening, just moving, like someone on the other side was testing it, without committing. I backed up the steps 2 at a time, slammed the basement door, and for the first time in my life, I drove a nail into a board, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, because the only thought louder than fear was the certainty that whoever lived under this cavern did not want us to meet them face to face. Later, when we finally got a weak signal on our phones, we called the sheriff. The dispatcher asked for the address. I read it off the listing. There was a pause. She asked for a GPS, pin, anything, and when I said the map app wouldn't load, her tone shifted, and she told us to stay inside, and not go looking for anyone outside until a unit could reach us. "Sir," she said, "there is no registered dwelling at that location. Are you sure you're not on private timberland?" I looked at Mara. She looked at me, and from the kitchen behind the nailed-shut door came one soft knock, like a reminder that paperwork doesn't change what's in the dark. We didn't find the diary because we were exploring. We found it because the cabin kept making a sound like someone shifting weight under the floor, and once you hear that, you can't unhear it. It started as a soft creak beneath the living room rug, the kind of noise you blame on old wood and temperature changes. Then it became rhythmic, almost polite, creak pause, always from the same spot, as if the house had a heartbeat, and we'd finally noticed it. Mara tried to ignore it, turned the TV up, laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny, but every time the sound came, she flinched like it had said her name. By midnight the wind had stopped, and the cabin was so quiet we could hear our own breathing, which meant the creaks stood out even more deliberate and patient. I got on my hands and knees and pressed my ear to the rug. The sound came from directly beneath the coffee table. I lifted one corner of the rug and found a section of hardwood that looked newer than the rest. A rectangle of planks with slightly cleaner varnish, like someone had replaced a patch and hoped no one would kneel down to admire the workmanship. I ran my fingers along the seams. One board shifted under pressure just a hair, and cold air leaked up through the crack. Not basement air, not the general chill of winter. This was colder, damp, like it had been held in a space that never saw sunlight. Mara whispered, "Please, don't." That was her new phrase, the one she used when she could feel us stepping onto another path that didn't lead back to normal. I told her I'd just check, just confirm it was a repair job, but my voice sounded like a lie even to me. I fetched a butter knife and slid it into the seam. The board lifted with a soft snap, like a lid, releasing. Under it was a shallow cavity between joists, only a few inches deep, and inside that cavity sat a small notebook wrapped in a plastic grocery bag. The bag was tied tight, knotted twice, as if the person who hid it expected moisture insects time. I pulled it out, and the bag left a wet print on my palm. The notebook itself was black, cheap, the kind you buy at a gas station, and it was heavier than paper should be, because the pages were swollen with humidity. On the front, written in block letters, with a felt tip marker, was the word guests. No name, just that. Mara stood behind me, arms wrapped around herself, watching the notebook like it might blink. I opened it carefully, half expecting a smell, and there was one old sweat, and something metallic like pennies warmed in a fist. The first page was dated years ago. The handwriting was neat, almost formal. "If you're reading this, you're inside now," it began. "Don't make noise at night. The house hears it, and so do they." I looked up at Mara. Her mouth had gone slightly open the way it does when fear pulls the air out of you. I flipped to the next page. More dates spaced out over months, then weeks, then days. It read like a log, kept by someone who had no one to tell, so they wrote to the floor. Entries described the same cabin, the same kitchen, the same view of trees, but from angles that made my skin crawl. I watched them sleep from the vent. One line said, "They don't lock the inside handle. They never do." I told myself it was fiction. A prank left by a previous guest. A creepy prop. But then I saw the details that were too specific to be generic. The writer noted a knot in the curtain cord by the back window. Noted a chip in the coffee table corner. Noted that the third floorboard from the fireplace squeaked unless you stepped on its left edge. Mara whispered, "Stop reading." But my eyes kept moving, because the diary was doing the one thing the cabin wouldn't. It was explaining itself. Halfway through the voice, in the entries, shifted. The careful handwriting became tighter, more urgent. "They started bringing people," it said. "They stand at the glass and breathe until it fogs. They like to see you react. If you don't react, they get bored. If you react, they get brave." I looked toward the living room window. The curtains were closed, but I could still imagine breath circles blooming on the other side, invisible, but present. I flipped again and saw drawings. Rough sketches of the cabin layout, arrows marking vents, crawl spaces, the underside of the stairs, a map of the floor beneath our feet, and then drawings of people. Stick figures at first, then more detailed, a couple on a couch, a man by the sink, a woman brushing her hair. The last drawing in the series made my stomach turn because it matched our posture exactly. Me kneeling by the rug with a notebook in my hands, Mara standing behind me with her arms crossed, chin tucked in fear. It wasn't an old drawing. The ink looked fresh, glossy, in places like it hadn't fully dried. Mara made a small noise and backed away from me as if the notebook itself had turned predatory. I checked the last page. The date at the top was today's date, and the first line read, "They found it sooner this time." My hands went numb. Mara whispered, "No." I flipped forward, but there were no more pages. The notebook ended there, like it had been waiting for the moment we opened it. Then right in front of us, the ink on the page began to spread. Not like a pen stroke being written, but like words seeping out of the paper, darkening and forming letters one by one. Mara grabbed my wrist so hard it hurt. The letters resolved into a sentence. "Don't look up when you hear the third creak." Before I could process that, the floor beneath the coffee table creaked once. We froze. It creaked again, the same spot, same pressure. Mara's breathing turned into little broken pulls. A third creak sounded louder, directly under my knees, and my body reacted before my brain could stop it. I looked up. The living room ceiling was low, pine boards, running lengthwise, nothing special. But above the patched rectangle of floor right where the coffee table sat, there was a seam in the ceiling that didn't belong, a thin line between boards that was too straight to be random. As I stared, that seam shifted. Not opening, not fully, just flexing like something pressed against it from above or below. Then a tiny shower of dust fell, and a single eye appeared in the crack blue-gray and unblinking, staring down at us as if we were the ones hiding. Mara screamed, and the eye vanished instantly, the seam snapping back into place with a soft click like a mouth closing. We ran for the door, not caring about shoes, coats, anything. The smart lock keypad flashed when I touched it, and for a split second, I was sure it would deny us. Instead, it unlocked on the first try, as if it wanted us outside. We burst into the cold and didn't stop until we hit the car. The engine turned over a sound so normal it almost made me cry. When we reached the main road and finally got signal, My phone buzzed with a notification from the rental app. Host, thanks for taking out the trash. Also, please remember to put the rug back before you leave. I stared at the message until my vision blurred, because we hadn't told anyone about the diary, and we certainly hadn't mentioned the rug. Mara, shaking beside me, whispered, "How did he know?" I didn't answer because my mind was stuck on the last thing I'd seen before we ran the patched rectangle of floor sitting perfectly flat, again, seamless, like it had. Never opened, like the house had swallowed the evidence, and was, already preparing for the next guests to kneel down and listen. The footprints on the roof were the kind of detail that would have been funny if they hadn't been impossible. We woke up to a world erased by snow, the cabin wrapped in white like it had been freshly built overnight. The storm had dumped so much that the porch rail looked like a smooth iced cake. The driveway was a blank sheet, and the woods beyond the windows were muted into a soft grey wall. For the first time since we arrived, the silence felt almost peaceful, like the night had finally decided to leave us alone. Mara made coffee, and I stood at the big picture window watching snow fall in lazy flakes, letting my shoulders unclench one notch at a time. That's when I saw them, a line of fresh prints pressed into the snow on the roof, right above the window, marching from the back corner of the cabin toward the front. Not scattered marks like drifting snow or falling branches, not animal tracks. Clear, boot-shaped impressions, with heel and tread, evenly spaced as if someone had walked with purpose. My brain tried to reject it, on contact. Roofs don't get footprints without ladders. People don't walk across roofs in a blizzard without leaving any trace on the ground. And yet there they were, darkened by the slight melt of pressure, crisp enough that I could see the chevron pattern of the sole. Mara followed my stare and went still. "No," she whispered, like the word might rewind time. We both looked down at the yard. The snow around the cabin was untouched, smooth as frosting, except for the drifted lumps near the steps. No tracks leading up, no tracks leading away. Nothing that explained how someone got onto the roof in the first place. My coffee turned sour in my mouth. I stepped outside, without thinking, the cold biting through my sweatshirt, and walked the perimeter of the cabin as carefully as I could, scanning for any sign of a ladder, a nearby tree close enough to climb onto the roof, any disturbance along the siding. Nothing. The snow along the walls was pristine. The only marks were the ones above us, as if whoever made them had arrived from the sky. Mara stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, watching me like she was afraid I'd disappear if I walked too far from the warm rectangle of the cabin. I forced myself to stay logical. "Maybe they're old," I said, though the words sounded weak the second I said them. Maybe the roof had tracks before the storm and the snow settled around them. But the prints were on top of the snow, not under it. I could see raised ridges along the edges where the boot had compressed fresh powder. They were new. This morning new, and that meant one thing: someone had been up there while we slept, while the storm raged, while the wind made enough noise to cover anything that might have warned us. Mara's voice was tight. Why would anyone do that? I didn't answer because the honest answer was worse than any guess. To prove they could. To prove the cabin wasn't ours, not even when we locked the doors. I circled to the back and spotted the only possible explanation: the chimney. The roofline dipped low near the rear where the wood stove pipe rose, and beside it the snow looked slightly disturbed, not in a footprint pattern but in a scuffed patch, like someone had knelt there. My eyes tracked that disturbance to the edge of the roof, where an overhanging beam sat a little lower than the rest. If you were strong, careful, reckless, you could climb the beam, pull yourself up, and use the chimney as a grip point. It would be dangerous. It would also be exactly the kind of thing someone would do if danger didn't apply to them. I went back inside, locked the deadbolt again, even though it felt like locking a cardboard box, and checked my phone. One bar flickered, then none. The cabin Wi-Fi was up, but every time I tried to load a map or send a message, it spun and failed like the connection was just a decoration. Mara sat on the couch, hugging her knees, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if the roof might open like a mouth. "We leave," she said, but her voice didn't sound like a plan. It sounded like hope. I agreed, but the driveway was still buried. The road beyond it likely worse. And the idea of sliding off a mountain lane felt like trading one unseen threat for another. So instead, I did the thing I always do when fear needs an outlet. I went looking for proof. I found a small step ladder in the utility closet by the back door, and dragged it outside my hands, shaking so hard the metal rattled. Mara begged me not to, but I told her I just needed to see if there was a way up, if the roof had been damaged, if the prints led somewhere specific. I set the ladder against the back wall under the eave, climbed 2 steps, and immediately regretted it. The wind was calm now, but the height made my stomach lurch, and the roof felt too close, like it was leaning down to meet me. I raised my phone, turned on the camera, and zoomed in on the footprints, instead of climbing higher. Through the screen, the prints were sharper. They came from the rear corner, near the chimney crossed above the window, and ended at the front edge over the porch. Then stopped. Not turned back. Not continued down the other side. Just ended at the edge, like whoever made them had stood there, looking down at the door, and then gone. I panned farther, and saw something that made my blood drain, a thin line in the snow where the roof met the porch overhang like a rope had been dragged across it. A rope, or a cable, as if someone had lowered something from the roof to the porch. As if the roof wasn't just a place to walk, but a place to deliver. I climbed down and ran to the front door, heart racing. On the welcome mat sat a small object that hadn't been there the night before, a single boot print pressed into the snow on the porch boards, placed perfectly centered like a signature. Beside it was a zip-top bag, weighted with a stone so the wind wouldn't steal it. Inside was a folded note. The handwriting was neat, careful, almost polite. It read, "You sleep heavy." Mara made a sound between a sob and a laugh. The kind of sound you make when your body can't choose between panic and disbelief. I grabbed the bag, hands numb, and looked back up at the roof. The footprints were still there, dark and calm, as if they enjoyed being seen in daylight. We spent the rest of the morning shoveling the driveway in furious silence, checking the trees for any sign of movement, jumping every time a branch dropped snow. And the entire time I couldn't stop thinking about one detail that didn't fit. The prints were the size of a man's boot, but the stride between them was too short, too careful. Like whoever walked, that roof wasn't tall, or wasn't walking like a normal adult. It was the gait of someone trying to be quiet. When the driveway was finally clear enough to leave, I went back inside for my keys and froze. On the kitchen counter and a thin dusting of flour we hadn't used, there was a fresh imprint of a boot tread, the same chevron pattern as the roof. Not smudged, not partial. A full, clean print, like someone had stepped there on purpose, then vanished before we could turn around. Mara whispered behind me. "He came in while you were outside, and I knew she was right, because the deadbolt was still locked, the window still latched, and the only thing that felt unlocked was the space in my chest, where safety used to sit." The shed was supposed to be a convenience, not a discovery. The listing mentioned it casually. Outdoor storage available for firewood and gear, and we wouldn't have cared if the cabin hadn't started running low on wood right when the temperature dropped hard enough to make the windows creak. By that point, Mara and I had learned the worst lesson. Remote rentals can teach. The smaller the problem, the easier it is to lure you into making a bigger mistake. We argued about it in low voices, like the cabin could hear. Mara wanted to ration the fire and stay inside. I wanted to grab more wood and avoid freezing through the night. The shed key was on the ring with the house key, a little aluminum tag labeled shed, as if that made it normal. I told Mara I'd be quick. She stood in the doorway watching me pull on boots, her face tense, eyes following every movement like she was memorizing me. Outside, the snow had softened again into a slow drift, and the woods were turning dark with early evening. The shed sat about 30 yards from the cabin, at the edge of the tree line, half buried in snow like an afterthought. I walked there with a flashlight in one hand and the key in the other, feeling ridiculous for being afraid of a wooden box. The door handle was iced over, and when I scraped it with my glove, I saw something odd. A faint smudge on the metal, like a thumbprint in dirt too fresh to be from last season. I fit the key into the lock. It turned easily, almost too easily, like it had been used recently. The door opened with a slow groan, and the smell hit first, making my stomach roll. Not the clean scent of split pine. Not damp earth. Something older, heavier, like wet leather and cold metal, and a hint of rot that your brain doesn't want to name. My flashlight beam swept across stacks of firewood along one wall, neatly piled, and for a second I felt relief. Then the beam moved farther in, and relief fell apart. Hooks lined the opposite wall, and hanging from them were things that didn't belong in a shed. Jackets, hats, scarves, a child's mitten, a woman's long braid, tied with a rubber band, the hair dull and stiff like it had been cut and left to dry. I took a step back so fast my heel slipped in snow. My throat tightened until breathing hurt. These weren't old donated clothes. They were personal, worn, used. Some still had stains on the cuffs and collars, the soft, dark marks of daily life. And they were arranged with care, evenly spaced, as if someone curated them like trophies. My flashlight caught a small shelf beneath the hooks. On it were wallets, dozens of them, opened, emptied, lined up in rows. Beneath the wallets were ID cards, credit cards, library cards, hotel key cards, all stacked by size like a collector's display. I didn't touch anything. I couldn't. The shed felt like a confession. Then I saw the photos. A corkboard hung on the back wall, with Polaroids pinned in a tight grid. At first glance, they looked like normal vacation photos. Couples smiling in front of a cabin, friends around a fire pit, someone holding up a fish by a lake. But the angle was wrong in every single one. These weren't selfies or posed shots. They were taken from a distance, from behind trees, from darkness, from inside a car. The kind of photos you take when the subjects don't know you're there. My hands started shaking so hard. The flashlight beam jittered across the wall like a strobe. I forced myself to look away to find the firewood and leave, but the shed wouldn't let me. In the corner sat a plastic tote, with the lid off. Inside were keys. Hundreds of keys loose and tangled, some with tags, some without, gleaming in my light, like teeth. A second tote held phones, old and new screens, cracked cases, scuffed, all stacked face down. A third held jewelry, rings, bracelets, watches, laid out on a towel, as if someone had sorted them by value. I backed toward the door, every instinct screaming to run. But then my flashlight beam caught one last detail that locked me in place. A small notebook on a crate, open to a page full of dates and short notes, written in the same neat block, handwriting we'd seen before. Next to several dates were two words, repeated with slight variations. New guests, early check-in, heavy sleepers, and then, at the bottom of the page, today's date, followed by shed visit. My blood turned to ice, because it meant this wasn't a random storage space. It was a schedule. It was anticipation. It was planning that included us, as if we were a predictable step. I spun and yanked the shed door wider, ready to sprint back to the cabin, and almost collided with a figure standing just outside the threshold. For a fraction of a second, my brain refused to interpret it. Then my flashlight landed on a man's jacket, dark canvas, the same kind we'd seen on hooks, only this one was being worn. The hood was up. His hands were bare in the cold, relaxed at his sides, as if he'd been waiting politely for me to finish browsing. He didn't lunge. He didn't shout. He just looked past the light, as if it didn't bother him. In a calm, familiar voice, he said, "Careful with that door. It sticks." I stumbled backward, into the shed, nearly falling over the tote of keys. The man remained in the doorway, blocking the exit without moving aggressively, which somehow felt more threatening than if he'd rushed me. Behind him, the woods were black and quiet, like they were holding their breath, too. I tried to speak, but my mouth wouldn't form words fast enough. He tilted his head slightly, listening to my panic like it was music. "People always go for the shed," he said softly. "It's practical. You think you're making a safe choice." He lifted one hand and without stepping in, tapped the aluminum tag on my key ring. "It's labeled," he added, almost amused. "So you trust it?" My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I raised the flashlight like it could blind him, like light was a weapon. He didn't flinch. He smiled just a little and said, "Don't worry. I don't take from guests who don't take from me." Then his gaze drifted past my shoulder to the shelf of wallets and IDs, and he said, as casually as if discussing firewood, "But you already did." Behind him in the cabin window, I saw Mara's silhouette watching Frozen. The man's eyes tracked to the window too, and for the first time his voice sharpened into something like a warning wrapped in kindness. "Tell her not to call," he said. "Out here, calls take time. And time is the only thing you're really renting." The first knock came from under the cabin at 1:12 a.m., and it was so gentle I tried to pretend it was the heat kicking on wood settling the normal noises you pay extra to hear when you want rustic charm. Then it came again, 3 taps, in the exact same spot beneath the living room, evenly spaced, like someone counting. Mara sat up on the couch, eyes wide, and whispered, "That's not the house." We'd chosen this place because the listing promised elevated foundation for mountain safety, which sounded responsible, until you realize elevated also means there's a hollow space under you, big enough for a person to crawl into and disappear. The cabin sat on short piers, just high enough that snow drifted under the skirt boards, turning the underside into a shadowed tunnel. During the day, I'd noticed a small vent cover near the back steps and a latched panel beneath the pantry, but my brain filed it under maintenance and moved on. Now, in the dark, every overlooked detail felt like a mistake we'd made on purpose. The knocking returned, same rhythm, same location, and I felt my throat tighten because it wasn't random. It sounded like a fist, on plywood, muted by insulation and air, but undeniably intentional. I stood, grabbed the fireplace poker out of habit, and killed the lamp so the windows wouldn't turn us into silhouettes. The room dimmed to firelight and reflected glass, and the taps paused, as if whatever was beneath us was listening to the change. Mara whispered, "Don't go looking." I didn't want to. I also couldn't stand not knowing, because fear grows in the space you refuse to inspect. I walked to the center of the living room and knelt, pressing my palm to the hardwood. Cold. Then, as if responding to my touch, the tapping resumed directly under my hand. 3 taps. Pause. 1 long scrape, like fingernails, dragged along wood. I yanked my hand back. Mara let out a small broken sound. I tried to call 911. 1 bar appeared and died. The cabin Wi-Fi icon was strong, but the moment I tried to place a Wi-Fi, call it spun and failed, like the connection existed only to stream movies, not to save you. The tapping moved not across the floor, like footsteps, but in jumps, appearing under the hallway, then under the kitchen, then back under the living room, as if whatever was down there knew the layout and was choosing where we'd feel it most. Mara grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around herself, like fabric could stop sound. "It's an animal," she said, too fast. "Raccoon. Squirrel. Something." I wanted to believe her. Animals don't knock in patterns. Animals don't pause when you turn off a lamp. The taps came again closer to the kitchen, now directly beneath the pantry. Then, from under the floor, a voice spoke faint but clear enough to turn my blood cold. "You dropped something," it said, calm and conversational, like a neighbor calling through a thin wall. Mara's eyes flooded instantly. I whispered, "Who is this?" The reply came after a pause, as if the person below was deciding how much truth to give. "I'm under you," the voice said. "Don't open the hatch." Hatch. The word hit my brain like a key turning. I remembered the latched panel beneath the pantry, the one I'd dismissed. I stepped into the kitchen, moving slowly, not wanting to give whatever was below the satisfaction of hearing panic in my footsteps. The panel was there, low on the wall behind a decorative basket, painted the same color as the trim. A small metal latch held it shut. Above it, the wall was perfectly clean, like no one ever touched it. Below it, the baseboard had faint scuffs. Fresh ones like shoes had bumped it repeatedly. Mara followed me and grabbed my sleeve. "No," she mouthed, shaking her head. The tapping stopped. The silence felt staged, like a performer waiting for the audience to lean in. Then the latch clicked on its own softly from the inside, as if someone had put a fingertip to it. I stumbled back. Mara covered her mouth to keep from screaming. The voice came again closer now, like it had moved directly beneath the panel. I said, "Don't it," murmured almost kindly. I backed away until my shoulders hit the counter. My mind raced through options. Run outside, find the crawlspace access from the yard, get in the car, leave. But outside, the snow had started again, thickening fast, and the driveway was a sloped sheet of ice that made escape feel like a gamble. I did the only thing that felt like control. I shoved a chair against the pantry door, then piled a full case of bottled water in front of the panel. Ridiculous defenses against something that had already proven it could move unseen. Mara whispered, "We should just sit and wait." Wait for what? For daylight, for service, for the person under us to get bored, as if boredom was the only weapon they had. We sat in the living room with the fire turned low and our phones charging, listening. For 10 minutes, there was nothing. Then, in the quiet, I heard a different sound under the floor, a slow, deliberate dragging, like someone pulling something long through packed dirt. The sound moved toward the back of the cabin, away from the pantry, and I realized with a surge of nausea that the crawl space likely connected to an exterior access, a hatch outside we hadn't found. If someone could get under the cabin, they could also get out without ever using the doors. Mara whispered, "He's leaving." The word leaving should have been relief. Instead, it felt like the moment before a trap snaps, because leaving meant he could come back whenever he wanted. I stood and peered through the back window. Snow fell in the porch light, and beyond it was a gray blur of yard and trees. Nothing moved. Then the tapping returned, not under the floor now, but on the back wall, low, almost at ground level, like a knuckle rapping on the siding from outside. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. It matched the pattern from before. Mara's hands were shaking so hard the blanket slid from her shoulders. "He's outside," she whispered. I stepped toward the back door, poker in hand, and forced myself to look through the small window in the top pane. The porch was empty, but in the snow right along the foundation I saw a narrow trough, a disturbed strip where snow had been pushed aside in a line like something had crawled out from under the cabin and dragged itself toward the back steps. The tapping came again, and this time it was higher on the door itself, soft and polite. Mara shook her head violently, tears spilling. "Don't open it," she mouthed. I didn't. I couldn't. I stood there, staring at my own reflection in the glass, and imagined hands on the other side, waiting for me to give them entry. The voice returned, now muffled by the door, close enough that I could hear breath. "You shouldn't block exits," it said, gentle as advice. "It makes people anxious." My stomach turned because he knew about the pantry, panel, about the chair, about the water case. He knew because he'd been inside the cabin before, or because he was still inside it in a way we couldn't see. My phone buzzed, with a notification from the rental app, the kind that sneaks through even when nothing else does. Host. Everything okay? Motion detected near the foundation. I stared at the words until they blurred, because they were either a lie meant to make us feel watched from above and below, or worse, a real warning from someone who controlled the cameras and the crawlspace. Mara whispered, "It's the same person." The tapping stopped. For a long minute there was only wind and fire and our breathing. Then, from directly beneath the living room again, one final knock sounded single, slow, like a punctuation mark. After that, nothing. No more taps. No more voice. We didn't sleep. When morning finally came, we found the exterior crawlspace access behind a drifted pile of snow near the back steps. A low rectangular hatch, half concealed by a decorative lattice panel. The screws weren't rusted. The panel was loose, as if it had been removed and replaced recently. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. At the edge of the hatch, pressed into the snow, where the drift hadn't smoothed it, yet was a clear handprint, bare skin against winter fingers, long and relaxed, like the person had taken their time. And beside it, placed carefully on top of the snow, as if it mattered, sat the pantry panel, latched the exact metal piece from inside the cabin, snapped clean off, and left as a souvenir to remind us that the space under the floor wasn't just empty air. It was a hallway someone else felt entitled to use. The dog refused to go inside, and I should have treated that like the only review I needed. We weren't even supposed to have him. Baxter was my sister's shepherd mix, and we were watching him for the weekend because she had a work trip. He was normally fearless in the way big dogs are, when they trust you, nose to the ground, tail steady, curious about everything. He loved car rides, loved new smells, loved the idea of a fresh place to patrol. The cabin listing said pet friendly, and the host even sent a cheerful message: dogs love the woods out here. When we pulled up, Baxter leapt out of the back seat and bounded through the snow like it was a playground, then stopped abruptly at the front steps as if he'd hit an invisible wall. His ears went up, his body went rigid, and his nose lifted toward the door. He sniffed, once sharp and focused, then backed up 2 steps. Mara laughed nervously. "Come on, buddy," she coaxed, patting her thigh. Baxter didn't move. He stared at the door with the kind of concentration that makes your skin prickle, like he wasn't seeing wood and glass, but something behind them. I tugged gently on his leash. He planted his paws and pulled backward, refusing to cross the threshold. His tail dropped low. A low rumble built in his chest. Not a bark, not a growl aimed at us, but a warning vibration like a storm rolling in. I told myself he smelled an animal. A mouse. A raccoon. Something had been inside before us. We propped the door open, carried bags in, and tried again. Baxter stepped forward. One paw sniffed, then recoiled, like the air itself stung. He turned his head and looked at me, eyes wide and glossy, a look that said in pure instinct, "Don't make me go in there." Mara whispered, "This is weird." I forced a laugh I didn't feel, and said, "He's being dramatic." But my own chest had tightened, because after everything that had happened in other cabins, the idea of an animal refusing entry felt less like a quirk and more like a verdict. We tried treats. Baxter wouldn't take them. We tried carrying him. He twisted hard enough that I almost dropped him, nails scraping my jacket, panic in his body. The moment his paws touched the doorway, he yelped, one sharp startled sound, and bolted backward into the snow leash, snapping taut. He wasn't performing. He was frightened. The only compromise we managed was leaving the door cracked and letting him lie on the porch boards, under the overhang, pressed against the wall, as if the cabin behind him radiated something he didn't want on his skin. The cold didn't seem to bother him as much as the inside did, which made no sense, and every sense at the same time. I set up a dog bed just inside the door, thinking he might warm up to it once he saw us relax. He refused to even sniff it. Instead, he stared past us, into the hallway, eyes locked on a point near the kitchen, as if someone stood there perfectly still. Mara followed his gaze and whispered, "What is he looking at?" The kitchen was empty. The lights were on. Everything looked staged and clean. Baxter's rumble deepened. He took one step toward the doorway, as if deciding whether he could protect us from outside the cabin, then sat down again and held his ground. As dusk fell, the temperature dropped and guilt started to creep in. "We can't leave him out there all night," Mara said, wrapping herself in a blanket and looking at Baxter's thick coat dusted with snow. I agreed, and that agreement felt like betrayal, because the dog was the only one in this situation whose instincts weren't compromised by pride. I opened the door wider and crouched, trying to make my voice gentle. "Come on, Bax. It's warm. It's safe." Baxter's ears pinned back. He stood, took one hesitant step forward, then stopped, again, trembling. He let out a low bark, single, sharp, and then he did something that made my stomach flip. He turned his head and barked at the baseboard inside the cabin, right where the wall met the floor, near the pantry. Not at the door, not at the woods. At the seam between house and foundation, his hackles rose like a ridge. He scraped at the porch boards with one paw, frantic, then barked again louder, as if trying to tell us where the danger lived. Mara whispered, "Under the house." The words landed with awful clarity, because we'd already learned what under the house could mean. I backed away from the threshold and pulled the door shut, not to trap him outside, but because I suddenly couldn't bear the idea of opening a path between whatever Baxter sensed and the space we were standing in. Baxter immediately relaxed a fraction once the door closed, as if the barrier mattered. He turned and stared into the yard, then back at the door, then back at the yard, guarding the boundary like a sentry. Mara's eyes shone with tears of cold and fear. "We should leave," she said. I wanted to, but the road was already glazing over, and the nearest hotel was an hour away down winding mountain lanes. "We can't drive in this," I said, and hated myself for how practical it sounded. We decided to keep Baxter in the car for the night, with the heat cycling checking on him every hour because it felt like the only place he didn't resist. The moment I opened the car door, he jumped in willingly, curled on the back seat and watched the cabin through the window with silent intensity. Inside, Mara and I tried to settle in, but our bodies never unclenched. Around 1130, while Mara brushed her teeth, Baxter began barking, muffled through the car glass, but urgent. I ran outside in my boots, slipping on ice, expecting to see an animal in the yard. Baxter wasn't barking at the woods. He was barking at the cabin's front door from his position in the car, eyes fixed on the knob like it had moved. I turned to look. The porch light was on. The door was closed. Then right in front of me, the keypad on the smart lock lit up as if someone had touched it. One digit flashed, then another. A soft, electronic beep sounded. The lock wasn't being triggered by wind. Someone was entering a code from the outside. Baxter's barking turned into a furious raw body slamming against the car window, claws scraping glass. Mara appeared behind me in the doorway, face pale. "What's happening?" she whispered. The keypad beeped again, then went dark as if the person trying the code had paused to listen to the dog. The porch boards creaked, once slow, deliberate, like a weight shifting just out of sight. Baxter's barking stopped, suddenly replaced by a low, steady growl that vibrated in the cold air. And then, from the shadowed corner near the steps, a voice spoke calm and amused, as if addressing Baxter more than us. "Good dog," it said softly. "You're the only one who noticed." My blood went cold because the voice wasn't coming from the woods. It was right there, close enough to be heard without shouting, and I couldn't see anyone. The porch light illuminated empty snow. The darkness under the steps looked a little deeper than it should have. Baxter growled harder, pressing his body against the car door like he wanted to launch through it. The voice continued, gentle as instruction. "Tell them to stop opening doors," it said, and I realized with a sick jolt that it wasn't speaking to us at all. It was speaking through Baxter, through the only living alarm system we had. I grabbed Mara's hand and pulled her back inside, slamming the door, locking it, then locking it again. We didn't sleep. At first light, when the roads were barely passable, Baxter finally agreed to step inside the cabin only for 1 second, only enough to grab his leash from where Mara had dropped it on the floor. The moment he crossed the threshold, he snapped his head toward the pantry baseboard and barked, once a warning shot, then bolted back out to the car. When we loaded up and drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw something that made my stomach twist. Baxter, usually eager to stick his head out the window, sat low and still, eyes locked on the cabin as it receded. And only when the times cabin disappeared behind the trees, did he finally exhale and lay down as if the danger had an exact boundary, and we'd just crossed it by inches. The first symbol I noticed wasn't deep or artistic, just 3 straight cuts and a crescent gouge at eye level on a birch trunk, fresh enough that the sap still looked wet in the grey winter light. If I'd seen it on a hiking trail, I would have assumed it was some bored kid marking a path, but it was too deliberate, too symmetrical, and it was placed exactly where a person would stand to look back at the cabin. Mara was ahead of me on the narrow, packed snow path behind the rental. Baxter's leash looped around her wrist, and she'd been trying to make the morning feel normal by narrating every cute thing she saw like we were tourists instead of 2 people who hadn't slept. The night before, we'd heard the tapping under the foundation again, 1 slow knock, and then silence, and the host had responded to our message with a single line. "Critters get restless in winter. Critters don't carve symbols." I called Mara back and pointed. She frowned, leaned in, and ran her glove over the grooves. "That's fresh," she said, and her voice did that thin thing it did when she didn't want to say what she was thinking. Baxter stopped sniffing and stared into the trees, ears up. I looked around and realized the symbol wasn't alone. 10 feet farther on a darker pine there was another different pattern, same clean cuts. Then another. The deeper we walked, The more we saw circles with slashes, angled lines like arrows that didn't point down the trail so much as they pointed around it. Like the marks weren't guiding someone forward, but guiding someone to positions. Each carving was at human height. Each one faced the cabin, not the woods. I told myself it was a property boundary system, something locals use to mark timber lots. But I'd grown up around rural land enough to know those marks are usually paint, not knife work, and they're not arranged like a choreography diagram. Mara whispered. Do you think it's the same people? I didn't answer because naming people gave the situation too much shape, and shape makes it real. We turned back toward the cabin, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach harden. The symbols weren't older near the cabin, and fresher out here like you'd expect if someone had been carving for years. They were all fresh, which meant someone had been doing this recently, probably during the storm when we stayed inside, probably while we were telling ourselves daylight equals safety. As we got closer, Baxter began pulling not toward the cabin but away from a cluster of trees near the back steps. He flattened his ears and let out a low, steady growl. I followed his gaze and saw a new carving on the closest trunk to the house, so close you could have reached it from the porch rail. This one was different. It was larger and deeper, the cuts wider, and in the center of the pattern, someone had carved a small, crude rectangle that looked like a window. Inside the window, a single-line figure stood stick-thin facing outward. Below it were two smaller figures. It didn't take imagination to know what it was supposed to be. People inside looking out. Us. Mara's hand started shaking and she whispered, "They're marking us." My brain raced through the normal explanations. Teens prank weird locals, until it snagged on one detail that refused to fit. The carving was positioned so that if you stood where the figure in the window stood, your eyes would line up, perfectly with our living room window. It wasn't random art. It was a sightline. I backed up, scanning the tree line, and for a second I saw movement. Not a person stepping out, just a slight shift behind a trunk. A dark shape sliding into a darker gap. Baxter lunged, barking once, and the movement was gone, swallowed by branches. Mara grabbed my sleeve hard. "We go inside," she said. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than it should have, like the heat was trying too hard. Mara locked the deadbolt, and then wedged a chair under the knob. I paced, trying to keep my breathing quiet, while Baxter sat by the door, staring at the baseboard, as if he could see through it. I told myself we'd leave after lunch, that we'd pack and get down the mountain before the road glazed over again. Then I went to pull the curtains in the living room and froze, because someone had carved the same crescent and free line symbol into the wooden window frame itself, right where the curtain edge hit it. It hadn't been there yesterday. Or if it had, I would have noticed it the moment my paranoia arrived, and my paranoia had been early. I called Mara over, and the moment she saw it, her face drained. How she whispered because the window had been latched all night, because the snow outside was untouched under the sill, because the only way to carve that mark without us hearing would be to do it from inside. Baxter started barking not at the door, but at the hallway. 3 sharp barks, then a low growl. I lifted the fireplace poker and stepped toward the hall, and as I did, I caught a faint scraping sound from the kitchen, like a chair leg moving an inch. I swung around. Nothing moved. But on the kitchen counter right beside the coffee maker, someone had set a small piece of birch bark, pale and curled with a symbol carved into it, fresh, wet sap glistening. A message placed where we couldn't miss it. Mara's voice came out cracked. "That's from the tree." I didn't touch it. I didn't want to confirm it was real with my fingerprints. My phone buzzed with a weak notification that shouldn't have come through with the service we had. "Host, hope you're enjoying the nature. Please stay on marked trails." I stared at the word marked until it stopped meaning anything. Marked trails. Marked house. Marketers. Mara backed toward Baxter and whispered, "This is his trail." The thought landed like a stone. The symbols weren't warnings to us. They were instructions to whoever came next. I walked to the front window and looked out across the yard. In daylight it looked empty, calm, harmless. Then I saw the last detail that made my hands go numb in the snow. Just beyond the porch steps, where the wind hadn't fully smoothed it, were faint scuffs in a semicircle, like multiple people had stood there in a wide arc facing the window, shifting their weight, quietly waiting. No full footprints, just the subtle disturbance of pressure applied and removed with care. The kind of marks you get when someone knows you'll look for tracks and doesn't want to give you the satisfaction. Mara whispered behind me, "Don't stand there." I realized she meant the window, not the porch. She meant the sightline. And as I stepped back, the cabin creaked once. One long settling groan from above the living room, followed by a tiny deliberate tap from the window frame right beside the new carving, like someone knocking on their own signature to make sure. We understood it wasn't a coincidence. The trail cam was my idea, which is how I know the worst part wasn't that the photos existed, but that I'd volunteered to create the proof for them. I'd brought the camera because I wanted something normal, to focus on something that made us feel like we belonged in the woods for the right reasons. Wildlife, snow prints, maybe a deer at dawn. The cabin listing even mentioned frequent visitors, and the host had recommended a spot near the back clearing for the best shots. That should have been my first red flag, because normal hosts don't curate your camera placement unless they're thinking about what you'll capture. I mounted the trail cam on a pine about shoulder height, angled toward the clearing, tested the sensor with my hand, watched the little red LED blink, and then walked away, feeling absurdly accomplished, like I'd installed safety instead of a toy. The first day it took exactly what you'd expect. Empty frames drifting snow, a rabbit streaking past at 2:14 a.m., a fox at 4:02 a.m., its eyes bright in the infrared. The normalcy made Mara relax enough to laugh, and for a few hours we almost pretended the cabin was just a cabin. That night, we locked up early, left the lights low, and slept in our clothes because neither of us trusted the dark to behave. Around midnight, Baxter growled once, then settled. Nothing else happened. No tapping, no whistles, no fake ranger. Morning came with clear sky and a cold so sharp it made the air ring. I told Mara I'd check the trail cam SD card, mostly because I wanted to show her something normal, wildlife proof the world still had innocent patterns. I pulled the camera off the tree. The housing was cold and dry, no new snow on it, which made sense because it sat under a thick branch canopy. I brought it inside, popped the SD card, and slid it into my laptop. The folder opened with 100 thumbnails, black and white night frames, declaring the occasional animal. I scrolled with a small, stupid smile, then stopped, because the next thumbnail wasn't the clearing. It was our living room. Not a generic living room. Our living room, the couch, the fireplace, the angle of the window, even the throw blanket Mara had draped over the arm. The photo was taken from above, from the corner near the ceiling, the perspective of someone standing on a chair to mount a camera where we'd never look. I felt the skin on my arms go tight. I clicked. The image expanded crisp and merciless in infrared. Mara and I were asleep on the couch, bodies curled toward each other like we believed closeness meant protection. Baxter lay on the floor, head up, staring directly into the camera lens with eyes like white coins. The timestamp in the corner read 2:37 a.m. I didn't remember taking that photo. I didn't remember the trail cam being inside the cabin. I didn't remember giving anything permission to watch us from above. Mara leaned over my shoulder, saw the screen, and made a sound like air leaving a punctured tire. "That's us," she whispered, as if the word us belonged to a different life. I scrolled down, hands numb, and there were more. A sequence. Arsen, Tia, Suyi, Arselo. Each frame, slightly different. Mara's hand shifting on the blanket, my head rolling a fraction, Baxter's ears tilting always that same fixed stare into the lens, like he knew exactly what it was. Then, a frame at 2:52 that made my stomach drop through the floor, the living room empty, the couch cushions still warm-shaped, the blanket disturbed, and in the foreground close to the lens, a gloved hand reached up as if adjusting the camera. The glove was dark, textured with a chevron pattern on the palm. I'd seen that pattern before in boot prints. My brain tried to refuse the implication, because it meant someone had come inside while we slept, climbed into the corner, moved our camera, aimed it at us, then either left or stayed hidden long enough to move it again. Mara whispered, check the next ones. My fingers shook as I scrolled. The next images weren't inside. They were outside again, back on the tree, aimed at the clearing like nothing happened. At 3:18 a.m., the clearing was empty. At 3:20, a person stood at the edge of the frame, half behind a trunk facing the camera. Not facing the clearing, facing the lens. They were close enough that the infrared caught the texture of their jacket and the curve of a hood. Their face was obscured, but their posture was calm, almost casual, like they'd posed. At 3:22, they held up something toward the camera. I zoomed in until the pixels broke, and my throat tightened, because it was the SD card itself, pinched between fingers, as if they were showing they could take it and return it without us knowing. At 3:24, the figure was gone, and the camera recorded nothing but snow until dawn. Mara backed away from the laptop, shaking her head over and over. "He was in here," she said, and her certainty scared me more than the photos, because it meant her denial was finally dead. I forced myself to check the camera, physically. The mounting strap was damp, not from snow, but from being handled with a glove. The latch on the housing was scuffed. The angle indicator I'd set was slightly off, like it had been re-aimed, and then corrected. Evidence on plastic and fabric, small, petty, undeniable. I opened the cabin door and looked out at the yard, expecting to see footprints. Something, anything, that matched the violation in my chest. The snow near the porch was smooth, except for one clear set of boot prints that ended right at the threshold, and then stopped. Not turned away. Not continued. Just ended toe pointed inward, as if the person had stood there listening to our breathing through the door before deciding to enter. Mara's voice came thin. How did he unlock it? The smart lock keypad flashed once, as if answering. My phone buzzed with a rental app message, bright and cheerful against the dread. Host. Hope you got some great wildlife shots. Guests. Love. The trail cam. I stared at the sentence until the words rearranged in my head. Guests love the trail cam. Not we love it. Guests. Like we were a category. Like we were repeat data. Baxter began growling, low eyes fixed on the ceiling corner where the living room photo had been taken from, and for a split second I saw the cabin the way the camera had from above, watching us like we were sleeping animals in a curated enclosure. Mara grabbed the laptop and slammed it shut, not because it erased anything, but because she couldn't stand the image of ourselves as prey. Then from somewhere in the house, soft, almost polite, came a single electronic click, the sound a trail cam makes when it takes a photo. We froze her. I opened the laptop again, hands clumsy, and refreshed the folder. A new file appeared at the top, with a timestamp of now. The thumbnail showed Mara and me standing over the laptop, faces pale, Baxter at our feet, and behind us, reflected faintly in the dark TV screen, a hooded shape near the hallway that wasn't there when we turned around. We found out the bridge was cut, the moment we tried to leave, which is how I learned that escape can be taken from you without anyone ever touching your door. Morning came pale and brittle, the kind of cold that makes the world look clean while it tries to kill you quietly. And Mara moved through the cabin, packing with the sharp, efficient anger of someone who refuses to negotiate with fear anymore. Baxter paced in tight circles, nails ticking on hard wood, stopping every few seconds to stare at the baseboard like the house still contained a breath we couldn't see. I didn't argue. I didn't suggest breakfast. I just shoved clothes into a bag, grabbed chargers, grabbed keys, and kept telling myself that once we were on the road, the spell would break, that this would turn into a story we told friends with a shaky laugh instead of a story we never got to finish. The driveway was half packed, half ice, and it took the car a minute of spinning tires to claw its way out, but it moved, and that felt like victory. The lane out was narrow, winding through trees that leaned over it like shoulders huddled against wind, and the snowbanks on either side looked high enough to swallow a vehicle if it slid. We drove slow hazards on both of us, tense every branch shadow, making my hands tighten on the wheel. After a mile, the lane opened to a small wooden bridge that crossed a creek cutting through a shallow ravine, the kind of rustic bridge you'd take a photo of in summer, the kind that looks charming until you need it to carry your weight. The bridge had a single plank, guardrail, and a warning sign half buried in snow that said, "One vehicle at a time." I eased forward tires, crunching, and then the front wheels stopped so abruptly Mara's hand shot to the dash. At first, I thought we'd hit black ice and lost traction. Then I saw it. The bridge wasn't blocked by snow. It was missing. 3 planks in the center span had been removed cleanly, leaving a gap wide enough to catch a tire and drop the car's nose into open air. The creek below wasn't deep, but the ravine edges were steep, and the water was dark and fast enough to make a cold death feel quick. I put the car in park and stared at the gap like my eyes could force the wood back into place. Mara's voice came out flat. No. Baxter began barking, frantic, as if sound could fill a hole. I got out, boots sliding, and walked to the edge of the missing section. The cut was too precise for weather. The remaining planks ended in fresh saw marks, pale wood exposed under a thin dusting of snow, and a few curled shavings clung to the edge like someone had worked fast and left in a hurry. On the bridge rail, a glove print in frost showed where a hand had steadied itself while lifting boards. I looked for the missing planks below, expecting to see them tossed into the creek like an afterthought. They weren't there. Someone didn't just sabotage the bridge. They took the pieces with them, which meant they planned on using them again, or they wanted to leave no easy fix. Mara stepped beside me, phone pressed to her ear, even though we both knew it was useless. "No service," she whispered, and the words were less information and more a confirmation of the trap. I crouched to examine the snow on the bridge. There were footprints, but they were faint, scuffed, careful, like someone had tried not to leave anything recognizable. Still, the tread pattern was familiar chevrons biting through powder, in the exact shape we'd seen in the roof prints and the kitchen counterflow. The prints came from the far side of the bridge, stopped at the missing planks, and then turned back as if whoever did this had stood right where I stood and looked toward the cabin, imagining us finding it. My stomach tightened and I forced myself to look beyond the bridge into the trees on the opposite bank. The woods were still. Too still. Then just at the edge of my vision I saw something that made my breath catch a thin rope line, stretched between 2 trunks, chest height, disappearing into snow like a temporary boundary. On the rope hung a small laminated card, pinned with a clip. It fluttered once in a weak breeze. I stepped closer, careful not to slip into the gap, and read it. It was the cabin's listing photo, printed glossy, the same warm window glow, the same friendly angle. Across it in black marker, someone had written, "Turn around." Mara made a sound behind me like a laugh that got strangled before it became real. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew we'd try today." I looked down again at the saw marks at the pale wood, and realized the cuts were fresh enough that the sap hadn't dried. This wasn't old damage. This was done after the storm, after we arrived, possibly while we slept. The idea that someone had been out here in the early hours with a saw working on the only exit made the cabin behind us feel less like shelter and more like a pen. I went back to the car and tried the GPS anyway. The map wouldn't load. I tried the rental app. It loaded just enough to show the host's profile picture, a smiling face that looked like every other superhost smile, friendly and harmless. A new message sat, waiting timestamp 12 minutes ago. "Heads up road maintenance today. Please remain on property until further notice." I stared at it until my hands started shaking because it meant the message wasn't warning us, it was narrating us. Mara whispered, "He's watching the app." I turned the car around carefully because there was nothing else to do, and the drive back felt longer, even though it was the same mile, because now every tree looked like a hiding place with intention. Halfway back, Baxter began growling, low in the back seat, eyes fixed on the rear window. I glanced in the mirror and saw it a set of tire tracks behind us that hadn't been there when we left. Dark grooves in the snow that matched our path, but were narrower, like a smaller truck or an ATV, had followed and then stopped. The tracks ended at a bend where the trees thickened. No vehicle in sight, just evidence of pursuit and the luxury of disappearing. When the cabin finally came back into view, my relief lasted exactly 1 second until I saw the porch light was on, even though we'd turned it off, and the front door stood a fraction ajar, just enough to show a thin wedge of dark inside. Mara's hand flew to her mouth. "We locked it," she said. Not a question, a statement of fact that the world had just contradicted. I parked fast, grabbed the poker, and moved toward the porch with Baxter barking behind me, frantic to get out, but terrified of the threshold. The door wasn't wide open. It was an invitation, a deliberate crack. I pushed it shut with the poker tip, then tried the deadbolt. It turned easily as if it had never been thrown. Inside the cabin was warm. The fire was lower than we left it, and on the kitchen counter, centered like a place setting, sat the 3 missing bridge planks, bolts lined up in a row, each one cleaned of snow and placed with care. Beside them was a note in neat block letters. "You can stop trying now." The siege started before dark, which was another lesson in how quickly a day becomes useless when winter decides the schedule. After the bridge, after the cracked door, after the bolts on the counter, Mara stopped talking in full sentences and started communicating in looks that said, "Whatever happens next, we survive it, and we never come back here." We checked every lock twice. We shoved the couch against the biggest window, even though the glass could still shatter. We covered the smaller windows with blankets to kill sightlines. We kept the fire going, not for comfort, but because warmth is leverage when someone wants you weak. Baxter refused to leave the area by the door, ears twitching at every shift in the house, occasionally growling at the pantry baseboard, like something beneath it still breathed. At 4:18 p.m., the power blinked once. Not a storm blink, a deliberate cut and return that felt like someone testing a switch. The Wi-Fi dropped for 10 seconds, then came back with a new network name visible on my phone. Cabin. Admin. Strong signal like a smug grin. Mara whispered, "He's here." And I didn't argue because my body had accepted it long before my mind could. At 5:03, the first stone hit the roof, not hard enough to break anything, just a thud that made dust fall from a ceiling seam. Then another stone closer, then a soft rattle against the siding like someone tossing pebbles to see if we'd flinch. Baxter barked once, then went silent, growl vibrating deep. I crept to the smallest window by the front door and peeled back the curtain a fraction. The yard looked empty until my eyes adjusted, and then I saw them dark shapes at the tree line, spaced out, like posts, too still to be animals. One of them lifted an arm and pointed toward the cabin with the same slow certainty we'd seen before. Then the porch light went out and the cabin became a bright box in a dark field. Mara's hands shook as she whispered, "Turn off the lights." We did, leaving only the fire. In the dim, the windows became black. Screens and movement outside became more visible. 2 figures moved closer, not running, not stumbling, just walking, with the calm patience of people who knew you couldn't go anywhere. A knock came at the front door. 3 firm hits, the exact cadence of authority. Then a voice muffled but clear, the same calm tone we'd heard from the fake ranger. "Open up." Sheriff's office. Mara's face tightened with rage and terror. "No," she hissed. I didn't respond. I stood still, poker in hand, listening for the small mistakes that give liars away. The voice spoke again, closer now, as if leaning toward the crack under the door. "We got your call. We're here to help." My stomach turned, because we hadn't made a call that could go through. Baxter lunged at the door, barking furious, and the voice outside chuckled softly, not bothered. "Good dog," it said, and my blood ran cold, because it was the same line we'd heard before, the same casual familiarity. A second knock came from the side of the cabin, not on a door, but on the window. Glass gentle taps moving along the pane, like fingers searching for a weak point. The tapping stopped at the corner where we'd shoved the couch, and then the glass made a faint creak, pressure applied from outside testing. Mara whispered, "They're going to break it." I forced myself to breathe slow. "If they break it, we go to the bedroom and lock it," I said, and hated how small the plan sounded. The voice outside changed, losing its friendliness. "You're making this harder," it said. And then, as if on cue, the power went out completely. The cabin dropped into darkness. So sudden, it felt like being submerged. The firelight became the only light, and it threw wild shadows on the walls, turning every corner into a hiding place. The smart lock beeped once, then again, as if someone was entering codes in the dark, the keypad's faint glow flashing through the peephole. Mara clutched my arm so hard it hurt. Baxter's growl deepened into something animal and desperate. Then, from the kitchen, the smart speaker we'd unplugged earlier spoke anyway, tinny and amused, like a voice coming through a wall. "You should have stayed warm," it said. "You should have stopped trying." Mara whispered, "How is it talking?" I didn't answer, because the answer didn't matter. The point was that it could. A new sound started outside the low grind of something metal dragged across wood. I pictured a plank being pulled in front of the door, the same way the earlier watchers had barricaded us from outside, and my throat tightened, because this wasn't a break-in. This was containment. The scraping stopped, and a heavy thud landed against the front door, like someone setting a weight there. Then a second thud, then a third, each one placed with care. They were stacking something. Locking. The voice outside returned, now not pretending to be law. "We're not here to hurt you," it said softly, and the softness made it worse. "We're here to keep you from leaving." A whistle drifted through the darkness, that free up, two down tune, and then another whistle answered from a different direction, and then another surrounding the cabin like a net made of sound. Baxter whined, a high broken noise he'd never made before, and pressed his body against Mara's legs as if trying to become smaller than fear. Mara's breathing turned into little sobs she couldn't control. I moved toward the back door, thinking about the crawlspace hatch, thinking about any exit that wasn't the one they were controlling, and as I stepped into the kitchen, the pantry panel latch clicked. The panel didn't open. It just clicked a reminder. Under the floor, the slow 3-tap knock sounded once, perfectly timed like punctuation. Mara whispered, "They're under us too." The house felt occupied on every level. Outside, inside, below. I backed away from the panel and heard glass crack, not shatter, crack the small bathroom window. First, a sharp spiderweb sound, followed by the soft sprinkle of falling ice or glass. Then a face appeared at the living room window, not pressed against it like before, but framed in the broken edge of curtain gap close enough that I could see the pale blur of skin in firelight. A hand lifted holding a phone, its screen glowing as it recorded us. The person waved slowly, almost friendly. Mara screamed, then finally, a full sound, and the scream seemed to please them because multiple voices outside laughed at once, low and brief, like a shared joke. I grabbed the fireplace, poker tighter, heart slamming, and shouted, "What do you want?" Silence fell for one beat, and then the smart speaker answered, with the calm certainty of someone reading rules. "You rented the warm house," it said. "You don't get to decide when the rental ends." Another thud hit the door, this one harder, and the frame groaned. Baxter barked and snapped at the air, frantic. Mara whispered, "We're going to die here," and I hated how easy it was to believe her. Then, through the dark, a new sound cut across the siege. A distant engine, low and heavy, approaching on the lane, crunching snow. The outside voices paused. The whistling stopped, mid-note. For the first time all night, the people out there sounded unsure. Headlights swept through the trees, bright bars moving closer, and someone outside hissed, "Move." Shapes scattered into the woods, fast, not panicked, but practiced. The pressure on the windows vanished. The weight against the door shifted. The cabin held its breath. The engine slowed near the porch, idled, and a car door slammed. A flashlight beam hit the front window, blinding white. A voice called out loud, official, and real enough that my knees almost buckled with relief. "Sheriff's office." "Identify yourselves," Mara sobbed. "Help us!" I ran to the door, yanking at the deadbolt, and that's when I realized it wouldn't turn. Not jammed from inside. Blocked from the outside, by whatever they'd stacked. I shouted, "We can't open it!" The beam swept again, searching. The official voice said, "Step away from the windows." "We're coming in." Another sound, metallic, as if someone was praying. Then behind the sheriff's flashlight, beamed deeper in the trees where the light didn't reach, a different light blinked. Small red, steady the same dot from the mirror watching the rescue, like it was just another scene to record. The front window glass finally shattered inward, with a crash that made Mara scream again, and cold air poured in like a living thing. A uniformed arm reached through, pushing aside broken curtain, and for 1 second I thought we were saved. Then, through the broken window, a phone slid across the floor and stopped at my feet. Screen-lit camera, open recording. On the screen, a message typed in real time appeared beneath our shaking reflection, smile. This one's for the report.